Hello everyone, this is Kawainame TV. This video is all about what if Sasuke and Naruto went back in time part 2. This story is a fanfiction. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Kindly click the bell button for more updates. Chapter 23. Konoha was the usual bustling hub of activity it always was when they finally made their way back. It was early afternoon, as they'd left early that morning and traveled at usual ninja speeds, instead of the civilian pace they'd set on their way out. As usual, Izumo and Katetsu greeted them at the gates, offering them friendly smiles and easy chit-chat. Submitting their mission report was much easier than it was last time. It had been a simple D rank, after all, no need for getting chewed out by a stressed Uruka for doing things they really shouldn't have. Really, if anyone was going to chew them out this time, it would be their sensei for making them stay for the festival. But it had been totally worth it, or at least Naruto liked to think. Sakura's storage scroll of prizes certainly agreed by any means. But now that they were back in the village, it was training time again. And that meant chakra chains. Naruto had been aching to try what Kurama had suggested 4 days ago, but because of the mission he hadn't been able to. And even if he had had time during their travels, Kakashi-sensei had more or less forbid him from using his Kekkei Genkai outside of the village. He hadn't really given a reason, but Naruto had a sneaking suspicion it had something to do with bingo books. Whatever the case, it didn't matter now as they were back in Konoha. And Naruto was nothing if not persistent, so he would get these damn chakra chains to work one way or another. As soon as they finished submitting their reports, he thought to himself, he would be off to training ground 7 in no time. Unfortunately, a certain sensei seemed to see right through him and grabbed onto his collar just as he started off down the road outside of the Hokage Tower. And just where do you think you're going? He drawled, eyebrow arched. Training, you know, he said, trying to wiggle out of the Jonin's hold. It wasn't very successful. No training without adult supervision, was Kakashi-sensei dry response. Darn, then we've been breaking the rules this whole time, Sasuke deadpanned, black eyes staring straight at their sensei. Stone cold murder. Kakashi-sensei's eye spasmed in a visible twitch of irritation. But he said nothing. Anyway, Kakashi-sensei continued. I'm not allowing it. No training until tomorrow, and that's final. He finished his sentence by letting go of Naruto's collar, essentially dropping the teen. Naruto immediately scrambled away out of his reach, fearing he might do it again. Ah, come on, he groaned, straightening himself out. I haven't practiced in 4 days. I gotta get this down as soon as possible. Kakashi-sensei raised an eyebrow down at him. What's the rush? He asked. Naruto stammered. If he was being honest, getting it down before the Chunin exams would be nice. And since that was a month out, I just wanna get it down, you know. He tried. Then, it gives me a connection to my clan. Okay, that last part wasn't a lie, but he was only talking about one specific member of said clan. His mom. He had all the looks of his dad's jutsu, his summons well, not at the moment, but soon enough, and had even fought with the man on the battlefield. The only thing he had from his mom was a name and a biju trapped in his gut. He didn't have her beautiful red hair, or pale complexion. Nothing. Nothing but this amazing Kekkei Genkai. A Kekkei Genkai he had no idea how to use. Kakashi-sensei seemed to see his internal turmoil and softened his expression. As much as one could anyway when only showing one eye. I get it, he offered, putting a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto looked at it in surprise. Kakashi-sensei had never shown this much affection before. What was different now? You want to feel like you belong to something, I understand, he continued, oblivious to his students' musings. Tell you what, tomorrow, no intense training, no missions, nothing. We can just work on that. Sound good? Naruto blinked, taken aback. He didn't have words to finish the sentence. Luckily, Sakura did. For real, sensei? She asked, stepping in. He nodded. In fact, tomorrow, I'll train all of you in whatever you want. The proclamation was followed by him retracting his hand and putting it on his hip in an assured, authoritative manner. Naruto, we can focus on your chains. Sasuke, Sharingan. And Sakura, he turned to the girl. You said you wanted to be a medic, yes? She nodded. Great, then let's start there. He offered them all an eye smile, the earnestly in his voice surprising them. With a lazy wave, he dismissed them and disappeared in a shunshin, leaving the 3 of them to their own devices for the rest of the night. So, Naruto said, anyone up for ramen? The next day greeted them with warm sunlight and cloudless skies. Not unusual for late May, but not necessarily appreciated. If the three of them were going to be training all day in this weather, they were going to get very hot very fast, and that was never fun. Especially when you had to stay in those dirty, smelling clothes for the rest of the day. They knew this from experience. As always, they turned up at training ground 7 at around 8, thinking their sensei would be at least an hour late. So it was a surprise when upon entering the grounds, they found their sensei already waiting for them, slouched against one of the training posts, book in hand. "Ah, good, you're all here," he said, noticing their arrival. He tucked his book back in his weapons pouch and pushed off from the post, striding up to them. "Although it is rude to keep your teacher waiting." Yes, they were supposed to be here at 7, like usual. But they'd thrown that out the window their first week of training. "Are you serious?" Sakura deadpanned, glaring up at him. The bastard only gave them an annoying eye smile before moving on. "Ma, anyway," he said, waving her off. "Who wants to go first? Whatever training you want, I'll help you." Oh, can I sensei?" Naruto immediately shouted. One would think he were an actual 12-year-old the way he was jumping around. "Go ahead," he said, nodding him off. Naruto took that as permission to start, and ran off to the center of the clearing and started stripping off his shirt and jacket as usual. He knew Kakashi-sensei wouldn't be able to work with him one-on-one as the Jonin had no idea how to help, so he started without him as always. Shrugging, Kakashi turned back to Sakura and Sasuke. "Sasuke, we haven't worked much on your Sharingan. Do you want to focus on that today?" Sasuke could have laughed at the offer. At this point he knew more about the Sharingan than Kakashi-sensei did. But he couldn't let him know that, obviously. "Sure," he shrugged, trying not to sound too annoyed. Sakura would punch him if he did. "Alright," his sensei nodded. "And Sakura," he turned to his last student. "We haven't talked much about what you are interested in. What did you want to try today?" Sakura put her finger to her lips in thought, brow furrowed slightly. She had mentioned before that she wanted to become a great medical ninja like Lady Tsunade, but the fact of the matter was that she already was. Maybe she didn't have as much experience as the Sannin, being only 17 years old as opposed to 50, but she was definitely amazing. But what would be the point of having Kakashi-sensei, a ninjutsu specialist, train her in that? For one, he wasn't all the knowledgeable in it, and for two, she didn't actually need to practice. "So, what then?" "If I remember correctly," he spoke up, interrupting her thoughts. "Haku gave you some poisons and Senbon back in Wave. We haven't worked on those at all as of yet. Would you be interested in doing that today?" Sakura had to think about it. She was a medic, which meant she healed people, and poisons were the exact opposite of that. That wasn't to say she wasn't grateful for Haku's gift, but it was very contradictory. But on the other hand, having a deeper understanding of poisons and the nervous system would make her a better healer. And it would help her in stealth missions, if that was ever a thing she would do. "I think," she said, worrying her lip. "I would like that." Then, nodding decisively, she said, "Yes. I would like to work on that, sensei." Kakashi-sensei smiled. "Wonderful," he said. "Then let's get started." Naruto was doing what Kurama said. He was feeling. He really was. But so far, nothing was happening. So, swallowing his frustration, he meditated on it. He'd done enough of it on Mount Myoboku that he was fairly good at it. But still, nothing was coming to him. Kurama had said it wasn't a technique, it was a feeling. Well, he didn't really know what that feeling was, and finding it was proving to be rather hard. Sasuke had said something similar to that, too. That activates his Sharingan was like lifting a finger. It wasn't something you thought about, you just did it. Yet despite all this helpful information, he still couldn't figure it out. How was he supposed to just do something when he has no reference point on it? Like explaining how to use a muscle he doesn't have. Sure, it was simple for them, because they have it. But to him, no such luck. They'd been at it for hours now. It was approaching lunchtime and the sun was high in the sky. So far Kakashi-sensei had worked with Sakura on Senbon throwing, teaching her the technique and style, as it was different than what they'd taught in the academy for kunai and shuriken. At the moment she was practicing that while their sensei moved on to Sasuke. Whenever Naruto had caught glimpses of it, he'd had to repress his laughter at the sight of the Uchiha just barely playing along as if the Sharingan was still a new concept for him. It was hilarious. With a sigh, he released his pose and flopped back onto the grass, the blades tickling his neck. "No luck?" Sakura asked from the tree line. She was busy pulling her Senbon out of various trees she had thrown them into when practicing. They weren't clustered in the least as was the goal, but then again, throwing kunai and throwing sanab are two very different practices. Not yet, he sighed, defeated. He turned to look up at the sky. It was bright and cheery. The exact opposite of what he was feeling. I thought for sure I'd get it this time. Sakura frowned in sympathy, hearing the edge of despair in his voice. She picked herself up from her spot and walked over to him, crouching down to be more at his level. Well, I'm no good at offering advice, she said. But, you said it was more like a feeling, right? He nodded, staring vacantly up at the passing clouds. Well, she continued, what were you feeling on the bridge? What made you activate them? I don't know, he admitted. It was all happening so fast, I kinda didn't really think about that. Could you try? He glanced up at her and saw her wearing a hopeful, earnest expression. One he'd seen on her before whenever she'd console a younger version of Sasuke back when they were actually genin. Yeah, I'll try. He sat up, face pinched in concentration. What had he been feeling? The memories were kind of hazy now, what with all the excitement, but there were still some things he could pick out. He started. I think I was scared, but not for myself, you know. Sasuke was trying to kill Haku, and Kakashi-sensei was in danger, and I just had to do something. But I couldn't, 'cause of all the senbon, and stuff. Sakura nodded thoughtfully, listening along to the story. So I guess I was feeling desperate. I dunno. But I wasn't angry. Not like the last time. When Haku and Zabuza had actually died. When he'd released Kurama's chakra. He didn't say these things, but Sakura seemed to hear them clear as a day. I get it, she said. So, if you can recreate that feeling, maybe you'll be able to access your chains again. And if you can do that, then you'll know what to feel for. Does that make sense? Sakura, ever the smart one. He smiled, then nodded. I think so. Great, she smiled. Then, good luck. And with that, she stood up and went back to picking up stray senbon. Naruto picked himself up off the ground and took a deep breath before closing his eyes. Time to focus. The sound of chirping birds was the only warning he got before someone screamed. Sakura! Sasuke shouted. Naruto's eyes shot open and saw their sensei holding Sakura in a headlock, hand alight with Chidori and pressed up against her neck. If anyone moves, she dies immediately, their sensei cried out, eyes cold as ice. Naruto could only stare. Was he insane? Had he finally snapped? What the hell was going on? Sensei, what are you doing? Sasuke shouted, Sharingan spinning madly. Do as I say, was all he growled back. Then he pushed his hand just a little closer to her neck, making her cry out in alarm. If Naruto was being rational, he would have known she could have easily gotten out of it, and maybe she would have known that as well. But as it was, she was fighting off flashbacks of having a Chidori aimed at her by a certain Uchiha, and was unable to do anything. Sakura cried out again, stirring something in Naruto. His sensei saw the look in his eye and glared at him. If you move, she dies. His words were sharp as kunai. He didn't even think, he just acted. A scream of frustration tore itself out of his mouth, and with it came a rush of energy, and the sound of trees breaking and soil being upturned. Immediately his eyes were filled with blinding golden light, and the sight of chains. Chains covered the training ground. Snaking through trees, around posts, into the ground, everywhere. And they were coming from him. Golden chains. Chakra chains. His chains. The clearing was silent. And then, clapping. Naruto looked up from his gawking to see their sensei, sans Chidori, slowly applauding. The feral look was gone from his eyes, and he'd recovered his Sharingan which he'd pulled out for his Chidori. Sakura was standing next to him with a hand to her neck, eyes wide and limbs shaky. Had it all been an act? Good job Naruto, he said easily. I knew you could do it. He offered him a thumbs up. The three members of Team 7 could only stare at their sensei in mild horror. Afterwards he treated them to lunch, but if they all sat at least 6 feet away from him at the other end of the ramen bar, well, then nobody could really blame them. Chapter 24. On one hand, Naruto was glad he finally got his chakra chains. On the other, what the fuck sensei? Before they'd gone to lunch, and after everyone had gotten over the initial shock of what he'd done, they'd started screaming at him. Sasuke looked ready to activate his Mangekyo and light him up with Amaterasu. Naruto, having pulled in his chains, was also lighting into their insane sensei, screaming about emotional manipulation and the ethics of it. Nobody really shut up until Sakura finally succumbed to her panic attack. Then it was Kakashi-sensei's turn to freak out. He tried apologizing, in his own awkward way, but ultimately he ended up offering to buy them all lunch as payment. Naruto managed to make him pay for all their lunches for the next week. He agreed. Sakura didn't calm down for a good hour, and Naruto understood why. Shooting an uneasy glance at Sasuke, as if to say, "Don't help me," for he was partly the reason for the episode, he crouched next to the shaking girl and wrapped an arm around her. He couldn't really offer any words, just comfort. If their sensei found the whole thing strange, he didn't say anything. Once she had calmed down, they'd made their way to Ikiraku's and ate in silence. Nobody made eye contact with each other. Or rather, nobody made eye contact with their sensei. Afterwards, Kakashi-sensei dismissed Sakura and Sasuke for the day, even offering Sakura the day off tomorrow. She declined, however uneasily, and said she had to get stronger and couldn't do that without training. He'd accepted that and waved them all off. All except Naruto. "Come on," he said, already walking away from the ramen stand. "Huh?" the genin asked. Not turning around, Kakashi-sensei replied with, "The sooner we get back to training with your Kekkei Genkai the better. The feeling is still fresh in your mind, meaning it will be easier to try to access them again. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to remember it." Naruto hurried to catch up with his senile sensei, short legs pumping hard to keep up. Man, he missed being taller. "So we're gonna use them again?" he asked in clarification. "Well, I'm not," Kakashi-sensei said. "But yes, we're going to make sure you know how to access them." Preferably without a trigger. Naruto had never heard his sensei sound guilty, but damn if that wasn't what he sounded like now. Oh, so this Kakashi-sensei actually had emotions. That was good to know. Naruto rolled his eyes, but wisely kept his mouth shut. They trained until nearly sunset. And Naruto being able to freely access his chains after by the end of it, much to his joy. When he dismissed him, Kakashi-sensei even ruffled his hair in praise, something he'd rarely, if ever, done before. It didn't quite make up for threatening Sakura's life earlier, but it gave him a nice warm feeling in chest that lasted until after he got home that night. Earlier that day, the three time travelers agreed to meet that night at the memorial stone to discuss the elephant in the room. The Chunin exams. Or more specifically, Orochimaru. They'd covered the topic in past meetings, but never in any detail. They'd simply agreed that subduing him would be best, as he had knowledge that would be useful for the future. But that was as far as they'd gotten. How they were supposed to do that, well, they had no idea. Hence the meeting. There was a tense silence between them as they all sat around the memorial stone. The cicadas in the woods were the only background noise, loudly crying into the night, but even their chirps couldn't diminish the harrowing sense all members of Team 7 were feeling. It was Naruto who broke the silence. "What do we do about the exams?" "Right to it then. We have to stop Orochimaru, no matter what," Sakura stated. "And we can't let him give you the curse mark, Sasuke, or let him kill the third." "I don't want that snake anywhere near me," he agreed under his breath. "But we can't kill him either," the Uchiha pointed out. "He has valuable information and skills that we might need in the future. We wouldn't have been able to fight with the previous Hokage on the battlefield without him." Naruto nodded, agreeing with his logic, however he hated to. "But he can't be allowed to go free." Both of his teammates nodded. "So then," Sakura started, voice wavering only slightly. "What do we do?" It wasn't a question anyone had an easy answer to. "I think," Sasuke started. "We apprehend him. Let him rot in a cell until we need him. We know where he'll be and when," he said. "All we have to do is withstand him and wear him down until we can get back up. And when we do, it's over for him." It was a sound plan, but there was a glaring flaw in it. "That's great and all, Sasuke," Naruto said. "But how the hell are we going to get back up? We'll be in the forest of death for 5 days, with no way of communicating to the proctors. How the fuck are we gonna get help?" To his surprise, Sasuke just rolled his eyes like the melodramatic shit he was. "Idiot, the scroll." He stated it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. What now?" The Uchiha let out a loud, heavy sigh of frustration. Next to him, Sakura looked as if she'd just figured it out too, but was going to let him explain, for his own sake if nothing else. "The scroll, the one we'll get at the beginning of the exam, remember?" he asked. Yes, Naruto did remember. The objective of that test was to retrieve a heaven and earth scroll and arrive at the tower in the center of the forest. He remembered teaming up with the two-faced Kabuto to get them. Ignoring Naruto's inner musings, Sasuke continued. "Iruka-sensei told us that if you opened it before you got to the tower with its matching counterpart, a proctor would appear and you'd be disqualified from the exam. Oh, that made sense. So, we open the scroll and get back up. Is that the plan? Yes, idiot, that is the plan, Sasuke sighed. That's great and all, Sakura cut in, a frown decorating her face. But actually fighting Orochimaru is something else entirely. The boys looked at her quizzically. She sighed. We might have the memories and know-how of 17-year-old sorry Naruto, 16, she added, making the blonde glower. But we only have the strength, stamina, and chakra of 12-year-olds. Strong 12-year-olds, sure, but still. It won't be enough. She sighed in frustration, looking down at her lap. I don't have my 100 hands of healing, she said. Naruto doesn't have his QB mode. Sasuke, you don't have your Rinnegan or Eternal Mangekyo. We're all put at major disadvantages here. And we're going up against a Sannin. This isn't something to be taken lightly. Her words were followed by a heavy silence. In the background, cicadas chirping filled the night. We're gonna figure that out, Naruto suddenly piped up, voice firm and self-assured. We have a month. It's the 30th today, he pointed out. The exams don't start until July 1st. I'm sure we can figure something out. Or at least you can, Sakura, he added, smiling at her. You always do. She tried to hide her blush by tucking a strand of hair behind an ear. Naruto's right, Sasuke agreed, surprising the both of them. You will figure something out. I know it. His smile was small but genuine. Great, Naruto smiled, breaking up the tender moment. Then let's do it, you know. The next few weeks were filled with training and missions. Their training was centered around whatever specialty they had chosen, with the exception of Sasuke. He insisted there were loads of scrolls in the Uchiha compound he could read rather than wasting his sensei's time, as he'd put it. Really, he just didn't want to pretend he didn't know how to use his Sharingan for any longer than he had to. And it had already been long enough. With Naruto and Sakura, however, they worked tirelessly. Sakura was starting to become quiet, adapt with Senbon and poisons, her groupings and aim were getting better and better. And that combined with her medical knowledge and perfect chakra control made the boys both very nervous of her. It was a good reminder to never get on her bad side ever again. On top of that, she was practicing more ninjutsu. It had never been her specialty, per se, but it would probably help to be more well-rounded as a kunoichi. Meanwhile, Kakashi was having Naruto work hard at mastering his Kekkei Genkai. Ever since the disaster of the day he'd finally managed to unlock them again, he'd been working tirelessly with them, trying to understand them better and learn how to use them in different combat scenarios. So far he'd learned he can use them up to 8 times a day, and that was without expending chakra on anything else for the rest of the day. So in combat, about 4 to 5 times. 6 if he really pushed it. As much as Naruto hated the restriction, it was almost humbling to actually feel mild chakra exhaustion. That wasn't to say it didn't still suck, though. But that was just using his own chakra, he'd never tried it using Kurama's. But then again, he hadn't used Kurama's since being back here. While it was useful and powerful as all hell, the more he used, the more unstable he became. He could use up to 3 tails of the 9 tails cloak and remain in relative control, but that control was flimsy at best. It wasn't a risk he was willing to take. Besides, he didn't have Granny Tsunade's necklace anymore. If he did go berserk, what could be done to rein him in? But aside from all that, he didn't want to risk using Kurama's chakra anyways. Aside from the fact it made him more feral, he didn't want to demand anything of the fox. He'd already dragged him back into his old cage, he didn't want to upset the grumpy Biju even more. So his chakra it was. Until there was an emergency anyways. Again, Kakashi shouted, breaking his train of thought as he threw more kunai in his direction. Naruto reacted and shot chains out at them, knocking them out of the air. They've been running drills like this for the past few hours, working on dodging and deflection using his chains. They'd worked on restraining and attacking foes with them yesterday. 2 chains this time, his sensei ordered, throwing his kunai again. Naruto focused and shot out only 2, striking down as many kunai as he could. Unfortunately he missed some and a blunted blade whacked him on the arm. Ouch! He cried, grasping at the forming bruise. That was the 5th one. Can we break? He called out breathlessly. Enemies don't break in battle, Kakashi-sensei said sternly. Why should I? Naruto scowled, pulling his chains back into his body. His legs were starting to shake from exhaustion, and sweat beaded his brow. Luckily it was Sakura who spoke up. Sensei, we've been at it for hours, she said, sweat beading her own brow. We have to let our bodies replenish our ATP and chakra. That's the only way a body can strengthen itself. Their sensei hummed, mildly impressed with her reasoning before shrugging. Ma, fine, he sighed. 30 minutes, then you're back to work. All three genin nodded and went to sit in the shade. Kakashi-sensei walked a bit away to read his book in peace. Man, Naruto sighed, slumping up against a tree. I never thought I could be so tired before. The bark he was leaning on scratched against his bare back, but it was nothing compared to the bruises dotting his body. He would definitely be sore tomorrow. Welcome to our world, Sakura breathed, taking a big chug of water. Then, after a glance at Sasuke, added, or rather, my world at least. Stupid, overpowered Uchihas. Yeah, but you have perfect chakra control, Naruto noted. Doesn't mean I have a lot, though, she retorted. I have the chakra of a 12-year-old, she groaned. Muscle mass of 1-2. I think you have more muscle than you did before, Sasuke hummed, glancing over at her. You looked like a stick back then. Shut up, she said lightly, smile pulling at her lips. I still mastered tree walking before you. Naruto snorted beside her. The great Sasuke Uchiha, she continued in a teasing voice, adding a fake pout for effect. Beaten by a weak little girl. Sasuke rolled his eyes, but it was hard to hide the fact that he was smiling. I bet I could still kick your ass, now, she said with finality, leaning back against the tree. Yeah right, he smirked. Fucking watch me, she said, before taking a drink of water. They went on like this for the next half hour, teasing each other and cracking jokes. For that moment, Team 7 was really and truly back together. Chapter 25. It was the last week of June when Kakashi got called in for a Jonin meeting. So, it's the time already, he thought with a sigh. He'd known the Chunin exams were coming up soon, he just hadn't known the exact date. Now I do. He knew he was going to nominate them. It wasn't even a question. It had been 5 years since the last time a Jonin sensei nominated genin who were fresh out of the academy, so it would come as a shock to everyone if he did. But then again, Kurenai and Asuma knew how hard he pushed them, and he was renowned for his prowess as a shinobi. Perhaps people will just assume his skills rubbed off on them. And perhaps they had. His team had proved themselves on the A-rank mission to Wave, and before that whenever they were training. Hell, they'd impressed him during the Bell test with their strength and intelligence. No doubt they would crush the competition in the exam. But, it's Naruto I'm worried about. Ever since the boy had unlocked his Kekkei Genkai, Kakashi had known it was only a matter of time before someone inside the village or outside put the pieces together. It was why Kakashi had pushed so hard to have Hiruzen grant him clearance to tell Naruto about his heritage. If he knew, he could at least be prepared, instead of flaunting his gift like he was sure to do for everyone to see. Even though the villages coming to participate in the exams with them were allies, nothing was guaranteed. People would talk. They always did. Minato-sensei, what would you have done? As usual, he got no response. It was their day off when Naruto decided to buy some more flowers for his mom. Sakura had decided to join him for the day and tagged along. She'd said her parents were getting overbearing again and she needed some time off. So obviously the best solution was to tag along with him while he visited a grave. Ignoring the irony of it, the two headed into the Yamanaka flower shop where Ino was waiting for them behind the counter. Billboard brow, she sneered, ignoring Naruto as he went to peruse the aisles. What are you doing hanging out with Naruto? Sakura stopped in her tracks and blinked a few times in surprise. For one, she hadn't seen Ino since they'd been brought back, so seeing a 12-year-old brat facing her with lips curled in disdain was a major shock. On top of that, it had been ages since she and Ino were at each other's throats. For a second, she didn't know how to respond. Eventually, she came to her senses and managed, "We're teammates," she stated dumbly. Unimpressed, Ino just stared at her. "So are you and Sasuke." She said it as if it were an accusation instead of a fact. "I would have thought you'd want to hang around him. Or have you finally admitted defeat?" The sly smile that followed the end of her sentence made a feeling of unease sink into Sakura's stomach. God, they still hadn't gotten over their rivalry over Sasuke yet, had they? Well, no, of course not. That was never settled until after the Chunin exams. And even then, how childish she had been, fighting with someone who had been her best friend over a boy. A boy who later tried to kill her. Albeit after she tried to kill him, but it was water under the bridge. Honestly, Sakura shrugged, crossing her arms. He's all yours. I'm over it. Oh, how she wished she had a camera. Ano's face dropped completely, eyes going wide and mouth hanging open. Dumbfounded and in shock, she might as well have looked like someone had just told her she would be the next Hokage. Sakura tried not to enjoy the moment too much and was glad when Naruto, poor, sweet oblivious Naruto, came back to the counter with his bouquet of carnations. He eyed the two of them oddly, then asked, "So like, how much do I gotta pay for these?" The two were walking down the back streets of Konoha when they heard a rustling behind them. Rolling his eyes, Naruto turned around, already knowing what he was going to see. 10 feet behind them, standing out like a sore thumb in the middle of the road, was a box with eye holes designed to look like a rock. It was probably supposed to be a camouflage jutsu, but it failed miserably. The attempt was so horrible Naruto nearly choked on his own laughter, knowing what the person underneath it would be capable of in a few years. "You're not foolin' anyone, Konohamaru," he said pointedly. "Come out." With an irritated humph coming from the box, it disappeared in a puff of smoke, and standing in its place were chibi versions of Team Ebisu. Udon, Moegi, and their fearless leader, Konohamaru. And to top it off, they were all wearing those ridiculous goggles Naruto had been so fond of as a kid. God, holding back his laughter was gonna bruise a rib. Tip for the future, Naruto managed, holding up a finger. Rocks aren't square, and they sure as hell don't have eye holes or make noise. HMPH, Konohamaru replied, chubby arms crossed over his chest. Moegi and Udon seemed to take the suggestion to heart though and were nodding thoughtfully. Behind him, Sakura chuckled. Evidently having grown bored of the conversation, Konohamaru looked up at the two genins and frowned. "Hey, what's with the flowers, bro?" Konohamaru asked, peeking up at the bouquet of carnations in Naruto's hands. Then, a mischievous sly grin slid across his face. "Is it for her?" He smirked, gesturing to Sakura. Naruto blanched. PSH, as if, Sakura cut in quickly, sparing Naruto from an awkward explanation. He really didn't feel like saying they were for a dead relative, or lying and saying they were for someone else. "No, he's carrying them for me," she continued. "'Cause he's such a good friend." "Thank you, Sakura," he thought, shooting her a small grin. Konohamaru, however, didn't seem convinced. "Sure," he deadpanned. "Whatever," Naruto sighed, waving him off. "Believe it, don't believe it, I don't care. Just get better at the camouflage jutsu so we don't have to do this again. It might have come off as rude, but you couldn't be a good shinobi if you got spotted every 5 seconds. "Fine," Konohamaru spat. "But I betcha can't catch me." And with that, he took off running in the other direction, kicking up dust in his wake. Naruto wouldn't have bothered following, as he had things to do until he heard a scream. Konohamaru's scream. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. He shared a look with Sakura. "That's not good," he said and took off after him. Moegi and Udon were hot on their heels as they ran down the dirt road. When they rounded a corner, they were overcome with a sense of deja vu. "Hey, put me down. Put me down." The screaming was coming from Konohamaru, who was being held aloft by his scarf by a boy dressed in all black. Sakura and Naruto froze in their tracks, breath caught in their throats from the sight that greeted them. "You know it's rude to bump into people," the boy said. "I oughta teach you a lesson, brat." He pulled his fist back to throw a punch, making Konohamaru flinch away, but was intercepted at the last minute by a girl's cry. "Kankuro, no," because that's who was standing in front of them. Kankuro and Tamari of the Sand. The Kazekage's children. They'd come for the Chunin exams with their brother, Gaara, Naruto breathed, finishing his thought aloud. Sakura shot him a quick, uneasy glance as if telling him to shut up. "Put the brat down, you dumbass," Tamari continued, oblivious to the time traveler's presence. "We didn't come here to pick fights." "Hey," Naruto shouted, getting their attention. It was hard to look at them let alone speak knowing what he did about them, and consider them friends and comrades. But he had to pretend he didn't know them, and that they were just some thugs picking on his friend. Not an easy task for him to do. "Let our friend go." Blinking, Kankuro glanced lazily over at him, almost surprised he hadn't noticed him sooner. "And why's that?" he asked with a bored tone, seeming to come to the conclusion that Naruto wasn't worth his time. Naruto grimaced. "Konohamaru wouldn't like this one. Because that's the Hokage's grandson you're picking on. Judging by your headbands, you guys are foreign ninjas, so I doubt you wanna get on the bad side of this village, you know." Like the cloth was burning him, Kankuro immediately lets go of his hold on the scarf, dropping the boy unceremoniously onto the ground. It looked like it hurt. Well, Naruto thought with a sigh, it had gotten the job done. "You're from Suna, aren't you?" Sakura said, stepping forward. The two siblings looked over at her. "What are you doing here?" It was a pointless question for them, but it had to be asked for the sake of the conversation. Temari took the initiative this time. Chunin exams, she said, holding up a slip of paper. It was the same slip Kakashi-sensei would give to them in a few days that allowed them to enter the exams. Konoha's hosting this time, and our sensei recommended us for it. It wasn't the only reason they were here, obviously. But they couldn't let on that they knew that. You need 3 people to enter the exams, Sakura noted. I only count 2. Then, the voice that Naruto was both dreading and waiting with bated breath to hear said, perhaps you need to work on your counting skills. Naruto froze, fists clenching of their own accord. He looked up at the tree to their right to see the face the raspy voice belonged to and felt his mouth go dry. It was Gaara. All of Konoha's Jonin sensei were gathered in the Hokage's tower in a room solely designated for Jonin meetings. The Hokage himself sat at the front in his large chair, if one could call it that. It more resembled a stuffed cushion than anything. They were all gathered to discuss the upcoming Chunin exams. It hadn't been stated, per se, but the implication was obvious. They were Jonin. If they didn't realize what the meeting was about by now, they didn't deserve the title. Kakashi hadn't been a part of a full meeting since team assignments 3 months ago when he'd been given the little bastards. Fleetingly, Kakashi wondered if he'd known then how much of a pain in his ass they would be if he would have fought harder against taking them. In reality, it wasn't like he had much of a choice. He was the only one in the village who had a Sharingan to keep the Kyuubi under control and teach the last Uchiha how to use his. Even if he'd failed them, he still would have gotten them again next year, and be stuck in this stressful situation of whether he should or should not recommend them for the exams. God, being a sensei was hard. How had Minato sensei done it? The sound of a cleared throat brought him back to reality. Looking forward, he fixed his eye on the Hokage, who was starting to address his assembled subjects. You've been assembled here for only one reason, he started. It should be obvious by the members here. It's already the time, Kakashi sighed. Behind him, he heard Genma speak up. It's already been reported to the other villages, he reported. There's been an increased influx of foreign nin in the village lately. Then, so when does it start? There was a pause in which Hiruzen took an inhale from his pipe. Kakashi watched patiently. Well, he finally said, smoke billowing from his lips. I'll announce it properly 7 days from now. On the first day of next month, the Chunin exams will commence. The feeling of unease that had settled in Kakashi's stomach only seemed to grow worse. Now, Hiruzen said, let's hear from those teaching the new genin. Kakashi glanced over to look at Kurenai and Asuma. Both of them had hard looks on their faces as if determined about some resolve of theirs. Kakashi, Kurenai, and Asuma. They stepped forward. Well, would you like to enter the exam? After a short silence on their part, he continued. I don't have to tell you, but once a genin has completed 8D rank missions, they qualify for the Chunin exams, if nominated by their sensei, that is, he corrected himself. Then, shooting a look at Kakashi, added, and I know for a fact some of you have completed well over 8 missions. Both Kurenai and Asuma glanced over at him, Kurenai shooting him a withering stare. Kakashi sweet dropped. Yes, he may have pushed his genin a little harder than necessary in the past, but they handled it fine. No need to work up a sweat over it. Or a genjutsu, he added mentally, eyeing Kurenai warily. Asuma, Lord Third said, breaking him off his train of thought. Are there any genin you recommend from your team? Asuma nodded and stepped forward. Team 10, Ino Yamanaka, Shikamaru Nara, and Choji Akamichi. Kakashi waited to hear the verdict. Under the name of Asuma Sarutobi, I nominate them to take the Chunin exams. A surprised murmur rippled through the assembled shinobi. Most Jonin sensei didn't nominate their genin who was only fresh out of the academy. To do so meant either Asuma thought very highly of them, or very low. For if nothing else, the Chunin exams were a great way to dissuade genin from continuing on the path of a shinobi. Kakashi narrowed his eyes at the man. In front of them, the Hokage nodded in acceptance before turning to Kurenai. She stepped forward. Team 8, Hinata Hyuga, Kiba Inuzuka, and Shino Aburame. Kakashi stared, waiting for her response. Under the name of Kurenai Yuhi, I nominate them for the Chunin exams. This time, the reaction was larger. 2 rookie teams nominated for the exams. It was practically unheard of. As Kurenai stepped back, she locked gazes with him, and for a second, she seemed to be daring him. But the moment ended quickly as she took her place to his right again. All eyes were on him now. The pressure in the room seemed to be growing. Both Kurenai and Asuma had nominated their teams, and they had no experience of B or A rank missions under their belts like his team did. If he didn't nominate them, they might think he was lazy or didn't care, and in turn, would be seen as a poor sensei. Even so, Kakashi wouldn't care either way. But his team had already proven themselves capable to everyone in the village. He was known for pushing them hard, and seeing how they all came back unscathed from wave meant they were very skilled. So if he didn't nominate them, what did that say about his faith in them? But if he did, Sakura was wise beyond her years and an expert in chakra theory. Her strength, however much she tried to hide it, was incredible and was already starting to understand basic medical ninjutsu without his aid. In a few years, he wouldn't be surprised if she was on par with Lady Tsunade. Meanwhile, Sasuke was as skilled as one came. His taijutsu was impeccable, and he was insanely fast. He's practically mastered the Sharingan using scrolls from his clan and had already unlocked the third phase. His mastery over both fire and lightning nature was nothing to scoff at, and he already showed a high aptitude for kenjutsu. And Naruto. He was a powerhouse, being both an Uzumaki and a Jinchuriki. But he was also the son of the fourth Hokage and Kushina Uzumaki, two well-known jonin with far too many enemies. If he showed his chains, which he undoubtedly would, he was sure it wouldn't take long for people to put the pieces together. True, they might just accept that it's an Uzumaki Kekkei Genkai, as it wasn't solely used by Kushina, but still, he worried. His genin were strong. They were capable, also yes. But they would be in danger. Because of their skills, they would be made a target in the exams. And while they'd shown they can go toe-to-toe with much stronger enemies, they'd never done it on a scale like this. Shinobi with far more experience and knowledge pressing down on them, possibly breaking them. He didn't want that for them. They already had the look in their eyes that only seasoned shinobi had. Haunted. He didn't want to see that worsen because he pushed them into something they might not be ready for. But still, would it be fair to deny them of this? Kakashi didn't know. It was all so convoluted. Kakashi, Hiruzen said, finally addressing the man. What of your team? Making up his mind, Kakashi stepped forward. Naruto could only help but stare wide-eyed at his fellow Jinchuriki. He was standing upside down on a tree branch, watching the proceeding with empty eyes. There was a chilling air of apathy about him that sent a shiver down Naruto's spine. It was a drastic difference from the cage he had been fighting with not 4 months ago. Gaara, Kankuro choked out. You surprised us. Instead of responding, Gaara disappeared in a cloud of sand before reappearing in front of his siblings, back turned to Naruto and Sakura. Let's go, he rasped out. We've wasted enough time as it is. The two older siblings swallowed nervously before sharing a look. Alright, Temari nodded. Let's go. Hey, wait, Naruto shouted, stopping them in their tracks. Who are you guys? What are you guys? Panic flashed across Temari and Kankuro's faces as they stopped. Only Gaara seemed unaffected. It was Kankuro who spoke up first. What do you mean, what? He sounded like he was trying to keep up his casual, bored facade, but his voice shook slightly, giving him away. I can sense something wrong about you guys, Naruto bluffed. Something bad. What's up with that? He was trying to get at Gaara. He had to make a connection with him. He couldn't let him continue being so nihilistic and psychotic. He had to help him realize he was loved and cared for. He had to help him. You, with the gourd. He pointed straight at Gaara. The boy's back was still turned to him, but Naruto could see how his shoulders tensed up. Next to him, Temari and Kankuro took a small step back, both paling. It's you, isn't it? What's your name? There was silence for a moment after his question. Behind him, Konohamaru was clutching at his pant leg, Moegi and Udon doing the same with Sakura, who was shooting him a look that said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Well, sorry Sakura, no time to explain now. You wouldn't ask a monster for its name, Gaara finally said, looking over his shoulder with empty eyes. Why care for mine? Naruto grit his teeth, fists clenching tightly at his sides. I don't believe in monsters, he rumbled. Only bad circumstances. Kurama wasn't a monster, Itachi wasn't a monster, Obito wasn't a monster. The world had turned its back on them. But that didn't have to mean they were monsters. HMPH, was all he got back. He turned away again, ready to take off onto the roofs before Naruto yelled out, well my name is Naruto Uzumaki, and I'm not scared of you, cause if I'm right, then we're the same. And I'm no monster. He jabbed a thumb at himself. All three siblings froze at the statement, the meaning of it sinking in. He'd just admitted he was the same as Gaara, which meant he held a Biju too. But he was announcing it for the world to hear instead of threatening lives like their brother. In fact, Naruto continued loudly. I'm gonna prove it to ya in the exams. So, What's your name? The smirk the future Kage gave him was more chilling than any empty stare of his had ever been. I'm Gaara, he said simply. And I doubt you will. And with that, he was gone. Chapter 26. The days following the run-in with Gaara were tense ones. After seeing him, Sakura had decided to go tell Sasuke what had happened after they visited Kushina's grave, as originally planned before the run-in. The next day all three of them had been on edge. If Kakashi-sensei had noticed, he didn't comment on it. And if they trained extra hard during their drills, well, he didn't comment on that either. It was 2 days before the first test that Naruto finally took the initiative and walked up to their sensei to address the elephant in the room. Kaka-sensei. He started uncertainty, looking up at their lazy teacher. He was leaning against one of the trees on the side of the clearing reading his stupid book while they did their morning exercises. Hearing his uneasy tone, Kakashi-sensei looked up, blinking his lone eye slowly. Is something the matter, Naruto? He asked, lowering his book. Well, not really, but, he fumbled around for the right thing to say before Sakura coughed loudly behind him from where she was stretching. Right, he cried. Well, so we've noticed that there have been a lot of foreign ninja in the village recently, he finally managed. And, they're all genin here for the Chunin exams. Yes, and, their sensei drawled in response, giving him an expectant, yet unimpressed look. It almost felt like he was egging him on. Naruto fumed at the thought. Well, Naruto huffed. We were wondering if you had, signed us up. For it, maybe. Kakashi-sensei was silent for some time, simply observing the genin. A small trickle of anxiety wormed its way into Naruto's gut the longer the silence stretched out, and because his sensei's face was unreadable, he couldn't tell what he was thinking. Wait, had he not nominated them? The sudden thought sent a jolt of panic through him, which he fought to keep down. Well, he finally sighed, rubbing the back of his head in a tired gesture. I was going to wait to tell you all, but, since you asked. Naruto felt his jaw clench tightly from nerves as Kakashi-sensei beckoned the other two over, waiting patiently for them to get up from their stretches before joining them by the tree. Once settled in, the three looked expectantly up at him, almost holding their breath in nervousness. The Chunin exams are coming up, that is accurate, he told them. Lord Hokage told all Jonin-sensei about it 5 days ago. The tension in the air between all three genin was nearly palpable. If he didn't nominate them, then all their planning was for nothing. I would of course be stupid if he didn't, as they were far better than they were back when they were originally genin. But again, it was Kakashi-sensei, who knew what went on in his mind. I nominated you for the Chunin exams, he stated. The effort it took all three of them to hide the relief and excitement they felt was incredible. Should you choose to, he continued, oblivious to their internal thoughts. Show up at the academy tomorrow with these. He handed them all slips of paper proclaiming themselves entrance tickets. It had the name and time of where they were to meet for the first exam. If you don't want or feel you're not ready to take the exam, you can elect not to. A moot point, really, not that he realized that. However, he continued, should you choose to, I don't want you showing off or using your full skill set until I say, he said cryptically. It was an odd request for sure, and if they had been actual genin they would have broken off into an argument, shouting about how unfair that would be. But as it was, I don't want you three to be made targets of, he finished seriously. But sensei, Naruto scoffed, trying to ease the tension that had grown in the air. We're so badass though, no one can touch us. A hard, steely look flashed across their sensei's gray eye, effectively shutting the genin up. While you are all very talented, he admitted, an edge to his voice. There are others with far more experience and skill than your own. Doubtful, all three genin thought. Their sensei, oblivious to their musings, went on. And even so, it would be you three against everyone else. It doesn't matter how good you are, the odds would be against you. And I don't want to risk that. The seriousness in his voice made Naruto hold back any retort he might have been planning. If he wasn't mistaken, Kakashi-sensei sounded worried. Naruto frowned, that was never an emotion he'd seen or heard from the man. Yes, there had been concern, obviously, but never blatant worry. It was striking to realize that. Can you three promise me that? He asked them. Sakura and Naruto made eye contact for a brief moment, as if discussing what their sensei had just asked them. Then the same with Sasuke. It was fair, they decided. Slowly, uncertainly, all three genin nodded. Their sensei let out a small sigh of relief. Good, he breathed. Now, back to stretching. We have a long day ahead of us. The academy was bustling with activity the next morning. The ground were saturated with genin teams were hanging around outside, running through stretches, chatting about strategy, and anything else average genin did. Team 7 made their way through the masses carefully, making sure not to bump into anyone or draw attention to themselves, as their sensei had asked. And yes, that wasn't exactly what he meant, but the less people noticed them, the better. Probably. So what classroom was it again? Naruto asked once they made it inside, looking down at his slip of paper. Dumbass, it says 301, Sasuke huffed, pointing to it. I knew that, Naruto grumbled back, angrily stuffing the slip into his pocket. Next to them, Sakura just rolled her eyes, accepting that her boys would never not be at each other's throats for one reason or another. Best to just let it happen, really. Sakura, Naruto spoke up, looking over to the Pinkett. You took the Chunin exams again, didn't you? Was it different that time? Humming thoughtfully, Sakura thought back on it, going so far as to tap her chin. Well, it was different. Different tests that is. But the third exam was the same. She shrugged. That part was kind of easy though. But I guess training with Lady Tsunade does that. I bet, Sasuke added lowly next to her. Of course, this time around it's going to be far easier for all of us. We all trained under Sannin after all. I always wanted to take the exam again, Naruto hummed. After training with pervy sage that is. Never got the chance though. They'd made it to the stairs now, and started their journey up to the third floor. You don't get to be Chunin just 'cause you're powerful though, Sasuke pointed out, a sly smirk decorating his face. You're still a dumbass. Oi, Naruto cried. I'm smart enough to defeat pain. And kick Obito's ass. You're just too stubborn, was the Uchiha's reply. Too stubborn and too powerful. Behind them, Sakura huffed out a defeated sigh. Boys, she thought. Once they made it to the second floor, the sounds of loud arguing and frustration echoed into the hallway. The genjutsu, Sakura reminded them, pointing to the sign above one of the doors reading, 301, despite the fact that they weren't on the third floor. Naruto vaguely remembered this. There had been 2 genin blocking the doorway who wouldn't let anyone through, despite it being the testing room. Except it hadn't been the testing room, it had been a test in and of itself. Only when Sakura and Sasuke had pointed it out had the illusion dropped and people realized it was the wrong classroom. Suddenly, the sight of 3 certain genin caught his eye, and his heart stopped. Hey, Naruto hissed suddenly, grabbing Sasuke's sleeve to stop him from continuing up the stairs. What? He hissed back, tearing his sleeve away. We have to go out there. Why? Sasuke growled. If they're too stupid to see a genjutsu, they shouldn't become Chunin. Not that, Naruto hissed back. That. He pointed down the hall to one of the teams hanging around arguing with the 2 Absonite genin. There was a boy in a god-awful green jumpsuit, a girl in a pink kippao-style blouse, and Neji, he breathed, limbs frozen and wide eyes trained on the Hyuga. Next to him, Sakura's breath caught in her throat, eyes trained on the genin as well. Who? Sasuke asked. His voice caught in his throat. God, how was he supposed to talk? It shouldn't be this hard. He sacrificed himself for me in the war, he mumbled, eyes trained on the boy's back. He was my friend. Sasuke looked back and forth between the Hyuga and Naruto, as if trying to determine why that would be. Do you know each other yet? He asked carefully, eyeing him. Naruto just shook his head, not trusting his voice. An indiscernible look passed across the Uchiha's face, too quick to catch. But it might have resembled sympathy if anyone had seen it. Well, Sakura started uneasily, fairly shaken herself. Come on, let's go introduce ourselves. With that, she grabbed both of the boys' hands and tugged them down the hall. Sasuke lagged behind, reluctant to be dragged anywhere, while Naruto just stumbled along, still lost in his musings. We're just thinning out those who are gonna fail anyway, they heard one of the genin blocking the door day. What's wrong with that? Great plan, Sakura but in, pushing through the crow, no longer holding onto their hands. Only one problem with that. The genin, who looked an awful lot like Izumo and Katetsu, looked up at the newcomer and frowned. Yeah, and what's that? He sneered. Sakura smirked. It's the wrong door. There was a silent showdown between the 2 genin, where Sakura held his stare with her own icy one that dared anyone who looked at her to try anything. As was always the case, they didn't. The genin backed down, then let out a low chuckle. So you noticed, he smirked. All the surrounding genin were casting Team 7 looks of confusion and intrigue, trying to figure out what they had. Drop the genjutsu, Sasuke ordered. We just want to get to the third floor. Where the actual classroom is. HMPH, the other genin sighed. Whatever, you want it through the exams anyway. We've already taken it 3 times, and we've never passed. It was supposed to be a scare tactic, but Sasuke just laughed. I guess you suck then. This earned him a scowl from the 2 genin. They shared a look before the first one, the one that resembled Katetsu, glowered at him and said, you've only seen through the genjutsu, you still have to get past. He dropped low onto one hand, swinging his leg into a kick aimed right at Sasuke. Me. 2 things happened at once. Sasuke stepped back away from the blow, hands still in his pockets, while at the same time, a green blur rushed in between them and caught the genin's leg in his hand, effectively halting the boy in his tracks. The hallway went dead silent. There stood Lee, holding onto the attacking genin's leg with one hand, nonplussed. Behind him, Sasuke stood watching the scene with vague interest. Suddenly, Lee dropped his hold on the genin and let him fall to the floor. Oof, the genin let out, hitting the wood hard. Lee just smirked. Hey, someone said, coming up behind them. It was Neji. Naruto and Sakura's eyes widened as they watched the future Jonin walk up to Lee, scowl already in place. What happened to the plan? He chastised. You're the one who said we shouldn't draw attention to ourselves. Ignoring him, Lee brushed himself off and looked over his shoulder, as if looking around for something. His face lit up when he appeared to have found it, and he made his way confidently over to, hello, what is your name? He asked, standing directly in front of Sakura. Sakura blinked in astonishment, taken aback. All eyes in the hallway were on them, as Lee had just stopped a kick point blank like it was nothing, and was now just chatting up another genin like he'd done nothing wrong. It was a little jarring. I'm Sakura, she stammered out. Then, remembering herself, she asked, what's yours? I am Rock Lee, he cried, flashing a thumbs up. We should go out. What? Sorry, no, she managed, shrinking back. Sorry. Yeah, hands off, Naruto added, stepping up to the 2. Lee, recognizing the faint hostility coming off the boy, immediately backed down, dropping into a low bow instead. Forgive my forwardness, he cried. I hope you accept my deepest apologies. It's okay, you don't have to bow, she got out. Sorry about him, Tenten suddenly spoke up, stepping up to them. He's a little weird, just ignore him. Okay, I'm Tenten, she introduced. And that sullen Hyuga over there is Neji. And this, as you can obviously guess, is Lee. You seem like a very strong kunoichi, he suddenly announced, straightening himself up. If you will not go out with me, then I would love to fight you someday. Hey, thanks, Sakura managed awkwardly. I hope to fight you too, I guess. Tenten just chuckled behind Lee while Neji barely rolled his eyes. Come on Sakura, Sasuke interrupted, turning towards the stairs. We gotta get to the first exam. Oh, right, she squeaked. It was really nice meeting you, Lee, and you Tenten. She stopped and looked over at Neji, but before she could say anything, her words caught in her throat. She couldn't quite bring herself to greet him. The image of his corpse skewered by the jubi fresh in her mind. It happened months ago for them, but, seeing him again, it just triggered something in her. It was nice meeting you all, she settled on, giving the team a small wave before being led off by her own team back towards the stairs. They finally made it to room 301 after not even a 5-minute walk. And that was because there was no Lee to challenge them this time, which Naruto couldn't decide was a good thing or not. Regardless, they made it to the right room, no Kakashi-sensei to greet them this time like he had last, and pushed open the doors. Immediately upon entering the room, someone tackled Sasuke. Sasuke, you're late, someone shrieked. It was Ino, and she was launching herself at him. Without thinking, he judo flipped her over his shoulder, using her momentum to carry through. She smacked hard against the ground, face up towards the ceiling. She let out a moan as she tried to get air back into her lungs. Don't startle me, Sasuke clipped, getting over the shock. Ino, still on the ground, just blinked up at him in both admiration and startlement. Oh okay, was her timid response. Rolling his eyes, the Uchiha helped her up, stuffing his hands back in his pockets as soon as she was on her feet. I just haven't seen you in a while, she blushed. Guess I was just a bit too excited. Sasuke, but aside from that he gave no response. Hey Ino, Naruto greeted casually, offering a small wave. Ino gave a kind smile back. Oi, Ino, someone called from off to the side. Looking over, Naruto spotted Chibi Shikamaru and Chibi Choji walking towards them. As usual, Shikamaru had his hands stuffed in his pockets and was slouching so much Naruto was sure Sakura would be freaking out over spinal health. Next to him, Choji was munching on a bag of chips. Because, for some reason, he literally always had chips on him. Even though weapons pouches were for, well, weapons. Not food. Come on, don't make a scene, the future Jonin sighed. Hey Naruto, he added, nodding to the other genin. Naruto offered a big smile back, glad to see his friend again, even if they weren't great friends yet. I'm surprised you guys are taking the test too, he continued. Most rookie genin don't. Haven't you been keeping up with the village gossip? Ino asked, scandalized. The deadpan look Shikamaru have her was all the answer she needed. Huffing, Ino brushed her hair out of her face and set her hands on her hips. Anyways, she started. They did an A-rank mission like last month or something. They all got out fine, too. I mean seriously, are you living under a rock? Shikamaru just shrugged nonchalant. I guess that's pretty cool, he sighed. We haven't done anything like that, so I don't get why Asuma-sensei nominated us. Asuma. The name felt like a punch to the gut. Both Naruto and Sakura's faces dropped, memories of the fallen Jonin playing through their head. The funeral, the revenge mission, Kurenai. Yahoo found you. Speak of the devil, and it shall appear. Trying to shake off the shock the mention of a once dead teammate brought, Sakura and Naruto turned to face the incoming teammate, Kurenai-sensei's team. Geez, you guys too, Shikamaru groaned. Looks like we're all here, Chibi-Kiba smirked, ignoring Shikamaru. A tiny Akamaru sat on top of his head and yipped in agreement. And geez, when was the last time he had been so tiny? Man, all of the rookies, Kiba continued. Guess we're all kick-ass, huh? Ha, you wish, Ino scoffed across from him. Team 10's gonna kick your asses, no doubt. HMPH, as if, the Inuzuka barked. We've been training a lot, no way we'll lose to you. While the two teams bickered back and forth, Naruto noticed Hinata almost hiding behind Shino, face beat red. Oh shit, he thought in panic. She's still got a crush on me. But I'm 17. Hello, Naruto, she mumbled, noticing him staring. Fuck, 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 fuck. What do I do? Luckily, he was saved by another voice, a familiar voice, interrupting. Hey you guys, you should be more quiet. Turning around, Naruto had to fight hard to keep his fists unclenched as he locked eyes with none other than Kabuto Yakushi, Orochimaru's lackey and spy. Out of the corner of his eye, Naruto saw Sasuke's eyes narrow threateningly, finger twitching as if itching to start a jutsu. Sakura was the same. You guys are rookies just out of the academy, right? The traitor continued, ignorant of their hostility. Screaming like school girls, geez, this isn't a picnic. The other two genin teams looked more subdued now that someone older and more experienced was telling them off. Meanwhile, Team 7 was just trying their best not to deck the guy. It was proving to be rather hard. Are you sure you don't want me to give you some juice? Kurama suddenly spoke up. Frowning, Naruto shoved the idea down, as tempting as it was. I know he's strong, but we can't just take him out here and now, he shot back. Pity, the fox mumbled. It's been a bit dull around here. Naruto just rolled his eyes and focused back in on the conversation taking place. Kabuto was pointing out that they were drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Quiet down before he cause a scene, he finished. If we cause a scene you'll be drawn in, Sasuke pointed out dryly, almost glaring daggers at him. Which'll make you a target too. And I don't think you want that. Kabuto narrowed his eyes at the Uchiha. So I guess the Uchiha are smart, he hummed. What I am or am not is none of your business, Sasuke growled back, arms now crossed over his chest. Touchy, he smirked. Sasuke only narrowed his eyes further. Kabuto eventually got the hint and backed off. Right, well, he said. Good luck on the exams. And with that, he backtracked to his team, throwing them one last glance over his shoulder at them, glasses gleaming bright white. Once he was out of hearing range, Ino turned to Sasuke with a quizzical look. What was that about? She asked. You didn't have to be so cold to him. Was all he responded with. Both genin teams stared at him with apprehension, uneasiness radiating off of them. They knew he was distant from their time in school, but this was cold. We're just stressed, Sakura tried, seeing their unease. They didn't seem convinced, but they accepted it anyway. Whatever, Shikamaru sighed. Troublesome. Naruto tried to hide his grimace, but he had a feeling he was failing. Shit, Sasuke suddenly hissed, turning away and hiding his face from whoever he'd spotted. Both Naruto and Sakura raised an eyebrow. It wasn't like Sasuke to hide from someone. What? Sakura deadpanned. Not saying a word, Sasuke gestured behind him to an area a few yards away, where a genin team from Kusa was milling about. Hey, what's the deal? Naruto asked, squinting at them. They're just genin. No, he hissed. Her. He gestured again, and this time Naruto spotted familiar bright red hair and glasses. It was, Karen, you do as we say or else, you got it. One of the genin on her team growled. He was glowering at her like she was scum on his sandals. Not a look any shinobi should give their teammate. Naruto had only ever seen the other Uzumaki as a bitter teenager, so seeing her so meek and small was startling. Chibi Karen just nodded mutely to her teammate, movements subdued and withdrawn. That's not very nice of them, Sakura muttered under her breath, frowning deeply. Naruto echoed the same sentiment. Don't step out of line, the other Kusa genin ordered. You know the only reason you're here is to help us. Don't get smart about it. Again, Karen nodded her small, timid nod, head down and arms folded protective tight across her chest. She looked scared. Before he knew what he was doing, Naruto was racing over. Naruto. Sakura hissed while Sasuke tried to grab him. But he wasn't paying attention. Then, he was standing in front of the genin. Hey, he said, not knowing what he was going to say. Well, he had an idea. But it was probably crazy. Buzz off, the first Kusa shinobi said, arms crossed. The second boy copied the first, angry pout glaring him down. I'm not talking to you, Naruto dismissed. I'm talking to her. He turned to Karen. The girl blinked in surprise, shrinking away from the sudden attention. Without thinking, Naruto barged on. So this might sound weird, but I saw your red hair across the room and the only people I know with hair like that are Uzumaki, you know. And I'm an Uzumaki, except I don't got red hair like my mom did, and if you're an Uzumaki too that means we're family and I've never had family before, so are you an Uzumaki. Although if you or I don't know what you're doing in Kusa, cuz Konoha and Uzushio were allies and, everything you know. It was said all in one breath, words practically overlapping. It left poor Karen blinking in shock at all the information that just spilled from his mouth. Hey, we said buzz off. Quit bothering us, one of the Kusa genin said, trying to shove him away. She's not interested in your stupid rambling, ya weirdo. I can speak for myself, Soya asterisk crude, she squeaked, eyes suddenly hard. Apparently this was new behavior for her, is both the apparent named Soya and his partner stared at her, blinking in disbelief. What did you say? Soya growled lowly. Karen gulped nervously, backing away slightly until she was partially hidden behind Naruto. I didn't mean anything by it, she whimpered, eyes focused on the ground. Naruto, having had enough of these two assholes, spoke up. You don't really act like a team, you know, he growled, leveling the two boys with a cold stare. She's just here to make sure we become Chunin, Soya shot back. It's the only thing she's good for. The anger bubbling in Naruto belly burned hotter, threatening to seep into his chakra. Now's not the time, Kurama, he thought to the fox, curling his fists to hide the claws threatening to grow. I bet she's better than any, AU, he growled. He'd seen her in action, he knew she was. Oh yeah, Soya challenged, stepping into his space. His fists were curled at his sides in a supposedly threatening manner, not that he was all that intimidating. What's it matter to you? Wait, Karen suddenly cried, tugging on Naruto's arm. Please don't fight, she begged. Her red eyes were wide in fright as they flicked back and forth between the two boys as they squared off. Naruto, back off, a new voice joined in. Glancing behind him, he saw Sakura and Sasuke were standing there with scowls on their faces, bodies tense as if ready to spring into action. Either helping him cream this bastard or stopping him from doing so himself, he couldn't tell. Remember what Kaka-sensei said, Sakura reminded him in a hushed tone. Right, he remembered, thinking back to that speech the other day. Don't show off or make a target of yourself. He let a frustrated huff. Yeah, I know, he grumbled, stepping away. Soya and his partner looked smug about it, which just further irritated him. Come on, let's go, Karen, Soya said, walking away as an announcement was made about seating arrangements. Instead of immediately following him though, Karen hung back. Naruto, you said it was. She asked, looking over at him. He nodded. Are you really an Uzumaki? He nodded. Through and through. The girl gulped nervously in response, eyes flitting down to the floor for a moment before back up to him. I am an Uzumaki, she admitted in a small voice. So was my mom. The look of grief that flashed across her face combined with the use of past tense told Naruto everything he needed to know about her mother. She was gone. He grimaced at the realization. I guess that means we're family. She tried. Shaking off his frown, he nodded and gave her a big smile. I guess so. Before they could say anything else, their impromptu family reunion was interrupted by a proctor calling all genin to their seats, as the exam was about to begin. Karen started and was about to turn around before Naruto caught her arm. Hey, he whispered, holding onto her arm to stop her from leaving. Find me after the exam. Families gotta stick together, you know. A faint smile lit up her face. It didn't quite reach her red eyes, but a small blush colored her cheeks, showing her appreciation. Yeah, sure thing, she whispered back. He smiled back at her before letting go of her arm and letting her hurry up to find her seat. He looked for where Hinata was sitting instead of at the seating chart, as he remembered sitting next to her the first time around. Once settling himself in his seat, Ibiki Morino, the first exam proctor, got up in front of the assembled genin. The first exam had begun. Chapter 27. Karen watched as the blonde Uzumaki made his way to his seat, determined expression fixed on his face. He seemed so confident, so self-assured. Could he really be family? Karen wouldn't have believed it at first, just because he looked nothing like an Uzumaki. He didn't have red hair or pale skin like her or her mom did, but he was as boisterous as her mother said their clan was. And his chakra, it was so warm and bubbly. She'd felt it immediately when he entered the room, like a bonfire on a cold night. It was something she automatically wanted to latch onto, just because she never felt that back in Kusa. Maybe she had with her mom, but that was long ago. She couldn't honestly say she remembered everything about the woman perfectly, even though she wished she could. The memories were all tainted with bitterness and regret. She'd never met another Uzumaki before, she'd thought she was the last one. After all, she had no reason to think otherwise. To this boy smiling and bouncing around, it was so foreign to her. What did he do for the village? Did they treat him like they treated her? Did they treat him better? He said he'd never had a family, so he was orphaned like her. Did they kill his mom too? Push her to the edge where she couldn't crawl back from? Looking at the way he smiled, somehow she didn't think that was the case. The proctor up front continued his speech on the rules of the exam and signaled for them to start. Karen did. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught sight of her teammates glaring daggers at her. She had to pass this exam or else, is what their eyes said. Gulping, she turned to the clock. 1 hour until she could speak with that Naruto boy. Suddenly passing this test didn't seem all that important. Sakura was willing to just sit the test out if she was being honest. She didn't have to answer a single question or do anything. The point of this test wasn't to answer the questions correctly after all, it was just to gather information without getting caught. Which wasn't a problem for her. She'd already made Chunin, she could gather intel just fine. But that wasn't the problem right now. The problem was she was so bored. She was easily smart enough to answer all these without having to cheat, albeit it would still be hard, but she didn't have to. But on the other hand, she couldn't just sit here for an hour. God, decisions. Eventually she decided to answer the questions, not working too fast in the hopes of stretching it out for as long as possible. If she really tried to, she might even be able to push it till the last question. Maybe. Across the room, Sasuke was eyeing his own test. His Sharingan wasn't activated yet, as he was still debating the merits of bothering to answer the questions. He didn't have to, they were going on to the second exam anyways no matter what they did or didn't do. They just had to stay until the very end. Around him, he noticed some people begin to start cheating. Next to him, a boy was blatantly looking over at someone's test. It was so obvious Sasuke almost laughed. He didn't, but he did roll his eyes. He saw one of the Chunin proctors make a tick on their clipboard. So he'd seen it too, he thought. Good. Any ninja as obvious as that didn't deserve the title. A few rows in front of him sat Naruto himself. The boy wasn't nearly as panicked about the test as he was last time, but that didn't mean he was doing anything either. He was torn between looking around to see if he could spot any familiar faces and just straight up taking a nap. He didn't quite want to risk doing the first one though out of fear of one of the proctors thinking he was cheating. Nap it was. We went to settle down, but a voice next to him spoke up before he could. And Naruto, the soft voice said. You haven't answered a single question. Naruto looked up and spotted Hinata's blushing face gazing down at him. Her brow was furrowed in worry, obviously concerned that he wouldn't pass. Yeah, he replied. Would you like to copy my answers? She offered nervously, scooting her paper a little closer to him. He just shook his head. Nah, it's okay. I know what I'm doing. He gave her a winning smile for effect. She looked uncertain, but nodded anyways. All right, she mumbled. I just don't want to see you fail. You won't, he promised internally, remembering how she'd stood up for him in front of pain. She'd been ready to sacrifice herself so he could have a chance. But thank you. He went back to staring at the blackboard in the front, sinking into his musings of the future. One by one, teams of 3 were kicked out of the test. At one point, Konkuro left for the bathroom, followed by one of the proctors. Finally, 45 minutes into the test, Ibiki Morino announced the 10th question. Now, before we get to it, he started, hawkish eyes staring over the assembled genin. I'd like to go over the added rules for this question. Murmurs of unrest rippled through the classroom. These are the rules of desperation. This time, Naruto could see some of the genin sweating nervously. A few shifted in their seats. Boy was the man getting to them. First, for the 10th question you have to decide whether or not you'll take it. Immediately there was an outcry from one of the seats in the edge of the classroom. Choose. What happens if we choose not to? It was Tamari that had shouted. She looked so young. If you choose not to, Ibiki answered coolly. Your points will be reduced to 0, and you'll fail. Along with your 2 teammates. What does that mean? A random genin yelled, the same time another shouted, then of course we decide to take the question. Up font, Ibiki just humphed. And now, he continued, ignoring the outbursts. The other rule. Audible gulps were heard. If you choose to take it and answer incorrectly, that person will lose the right to take the Chunin exams ever again. While the rest of classroom silently freaked out, Naruto had to suppress the urge to roll his eyes. What kinda rule is that? Kiba shouted from somewhere behind him. There are guys here who have taken the exam before. Ibiki just laughed. You guys were unlucky, he said. This year it's my rules. But I am giving you a way out. Those that aren't confident can choose not to take it and try again next year. Now, he went on, ignoring the panicked looks on everyone's faces. Let's begin the 10th question. Next to him, Hinata shot Naruto a worried look. She knew he hadn't answered one question, and if he failed this one too, but Naruto was resting his chin against his hand, bored as all get out. Those that do not wish to take it, Ibiki called out. Raise your hand. Once your number is confirmed, leave. A boy next to him stood up, followed by the rest of him team. A group a few rows ahead followed suit. It went on until there were 26 teams left in the room, all visibly sweating. At that moment, Naruto decided to shoot up from his chair. I call bullshit, he shouted. Suddenly, everyone in the classroom went silent, eyes locked on him. The Chunin proctors around the edges were staring at him with wide eyes. Up front, Ibiki was staring him down, trying to understand what was going on in his mind. And why's that? He eventually asked, unable to deduce the reason for the boy's sudden outburst. This question is rigged, Naruto announced. We're supposed to cheat. Knowing the answers isn't the point of this. If you know the answer to the 10th question, that defeats the purpose of the whole test. And if you don't know, you don't have enough time to copy someone who does, he said. Besides, even if I answer it wrong and stay a genin forever, that doesn't matter. I can still become Hokage through skill alone. You don't have to have a fancy rank to get the hat. You don't have to have one to chase after your best friend, or go on S-rank missions, or fight in a war. He'd always been a genin. It didn't mean shit. So yeah, he finished, sitting back down. I'm calling bullshit. Ibiki looked almost impressed, looking over the blonde with intrigue. Very well, he said, unable to contradict anything the boy had said. But I'll say it again, your life is riding on this decision. This is your last chance to quit. Naruto just scoffed. Find someone else to quit, he laughed. 'Cause I ain't. Ibiki nodded before glancing around the room. All the other genin were looking inspired, instilled with confidence after Naruto's impromptu speech. The Chunin proctors were all giving Naruto looks of impressed admiration, some even smiling to themselves. Ibiki sighed, might as well get on with this. Good decision, he finally nodded. Now, to everyone still remaining, the whole classroom, minus Team 7, leaned forward, nervous and excited. I congratulate you on passing the first test. Naruto was smiling like an idiot as Team 7 regrouped at the doorway to the hall. Sasuke was giving him the most unimpressed look possible while Sakura could only roll her eyes. After Enko had made her striking entrance and explained the second exam, they'd been let go. Unlike last time, she didn't make them follow her to the Forest of Death to start the second test, saying there would be 1 day's preparation and to show up training ground 44 tomorrow at noon. Was the speech really necessary? Sakura asked with a sigh, eyeing their blonde teammate in exasperation. Duh, he smirked, clasping his hands behind his head. I gave a speech last time, didn't I? Yeah, Sasuke agreed. But how'd you figure out it was rigged? I thought you were a dumbass. Hey, I can be smart. Idiot. While they bickered, Sakura just rolled her eyes before tugging her boys out into the hall, ready to go home to get ready for the second exam. Karen was waiting outside the classroom for them when they walked out, hands clasped together in a clear sign of nervousness. Her teammates were nowhere to be seen, either having abandoned her or not noticing that she'd slipped away. Naruto, wasn't it? She asked, stepping forward. Naruto nodded. Can we talk? Alone. Naruto glanced over to his teammates. Sakura nodded encouragingly, offering a smile as well. Sasuke just shrugged apathetically. He didn't care either way. Yeah, Naruto agreed. Sure. You wanna go somewhere else? I know this great ramen place. Her smile was small, but it reached her eyes. Sounds great. Hey, Toiki, 2 bowls of miso and pork ramen, please. Naruto cried out as he pushed past the curtains. Karen was being dragged behind him by her hand, which was held firmly in his own. Naruto tugged her into the ramen stand and finally let her go, pulling out stools for both of them. Welcome back, Naruto, the ramen chef greeted. And who's this? This is Karen Uzumaki, he gushed, jumping up onto his stool. We're cousins. Toiki looked shocked at the declaration, but quickly slipped into an easy smile. That's great, Naruto, he offered. Come on, sit down, Naruto gushed, patting the stool next to him. Karen quickly slipped onto it, fingers going to drum the counter anxiously. So, how old are you? He asked, leaning on the counter. I just turned 13, she replied. Almost 2 weeks ago. Oh, well, happy birthday. Naruto exclaimed. They chatted some more while they waited for their food to come. About their teams, their sensei, their village. Anything really. When their food finally came, the conversation was halted for a good few minutes while Naruto dug in. Karen watched with amusement as the other Uzumaki slurped up his ramen like he hadn't eaten in days. Eventually he slowed down enough for them to resume their conversation. So, what do you have to do? She started uncertainty. To stay here. Naruto stopped slurping his ramen and looked at her. Wah, oh you mean. Instead of answering, Karen looked down at her half-eaten bowl of ramen, red eyes staring back up at her in the dark reflection of the broth. She looked sad, anxious. There were tears in her eyes, he noticed. Was she grieving? Back in Kusa, she started, eyes still downcast. My mom and I were allowed to stay because of her chakra, she explained. If someone who was injured bit her, then they would be healed by it. Even if they were on the brink of death. She shifted to cover her arms, as if self-conscious about them. Naruto followed her movement and noticed old scars speckled across her skin. They looked like teeth marks. A sick feeling dropped into Naruto's stomach at the realization. Your mom wasn't the only one with that gift, he thought to himself, mouth twisting in disgust. She worked at the hospital, helping heal wounded ninja. But the trick with her gift was that, for everyone it healed, it took away some of her own health. Her eyes were now brimming with unshed tears. Naruto, already knowing how the story would end, had his hands clenched tightly underneath the table in fury. One day, she didn't come back. She blinked, and droplets fell from her eyes into the broth, rippling and distorting the surface. They made me take her place after that. Every day, for years. I had to go to the hospital and let them bit me. It was horrible, but I couldn't say no, because I didn't have anywhere else to go. They were letting me stay there after all. She looked truly and thoroughly morose, head bowed and fists clenched. I'm actually only here to make sure my teammates get through the exam. They don't care about me at all. They shouldn't have done that, Naruto growled. They shouldn't have made you do those things. What they did to your mom was awful, and you don't deserve that. Karen blinked, startled, and looked up at him. Her eyes were still glistening with tears, wet streaks tracking down her face from them. But, we didn't have anywhere else to go, she breathed. Nowhere else wants us. Bullshit, Naruto scoffed. Did you know that the wife of the first Hokage was an Uzumaki? And that the founding clans of Konoha were related to ours? And like, all Chunin and Jonin wear our symbol on their backs to show the village's friendship, you know. Hell, if Kusa won't have you, Konoha will. Karen blinked, startled by the proclamation. You mean it? She asked, voice shaking. Her eyes were blown wide, still glistening with still flowing tears. She looked so small and pathetic, like a street cat that had been kicked around so much it had stopped seeking human affection. It was a heartbreaking expression to see on her. That's it, Naruto decided right there and then. I'm not letting you be alone any longer. We're family now. Absolutely, he assured. We can go talk to the old man right now, I'm sure he'll let you stay. And if he doesn't, well, I'm not letting Kusa have you. Old man, she asked as he threw some money on the counter before grabbing her wrist and leading her out of the shop. Yeah, old man Hokage. Or Gramps. Whichever. I've known him since forever, and he's got a soft spot for me, not that he'll ever admit it. As he spoke, he led her down the crowded streets, still tugging her along by the hand. She didn't seem to be putting up a protest though, and was only slightly lagging behind from the shock of it. He might be busy 'cause of all the exam stuff, but I'm sure we can get it. Especially if I just go in through the window. Probably shouldn't do that though, those Anbu are touchy. You know the Hokage? She asked, interrupting his monologue. Well, yeah, he shrugged, leading them around a group of civilians. Anyways, I'm sure if we ask nice he'll let you stay. And then those Kusa ninja you're with can't touch you because you won't be a Kusa shinobi anymore. They don't deserve the title anyway. Behind him, Karen could only blink in wonderment at everything he was saying, red eyes wide. Someone was going out of their way to do something for her. That hadn't happened since her mom. Is this what having a family was supposed to be like? Is this what having a brother was like? A blush crept up on her face from the thought, and a small smile followed after. His chakra was so warm, and he was so kind. Everyone's in the village was. She truly hoped she would get to stay. You want to what? Hiruzen deadpanned, looking back and forth between the two Uzumakis. The two had made it to the Hokage's office, somehow convincing the guards to let them through and see him, which had been an effort in itself, and were now addressing the man himself. Karen was standing with hunched shoulders and folded arms, clearly uncomfortable, while Naruto was standing with his hands at his sides instead of behind his head, his version of respect. The action didn't go unnoticed by the Hokage. You heard me, the blonde said. I wanna adopt Karen. We're family, you know. Hiruzen sighed, rubbing his temples tiredly. This is your doing, Kushina, he thought, remembering how much the redhead would latch onto family. Clearly her son had picked up the trait. Karen is an adult in her own right, he pointed out. And from another village. I simply can't allow that to happen. But what if? Karen suddenly spoke up, finally looking up from where she'd been staring at the floor. There was a hard, self-assured look in her eyes Naruto hadn't seen from her as of yet. What if I wanted to leave that village? She asked uncertainty. And join this one. Naruto glanced from the Hokage to Karen and back again. Hiruzen was leaning over his desk, fingers steepled together in thought. Well, he started. That would be quite complicated. Karen looked back down at her feet, disappointed. But not impossible. Her head snapped back up. It would take some time to get the paperwork in order, and a signed document from your village leader renouncing you from Kusa so you wouldn't be a rogue ninja and for you to be officially registered here, but it is doable. Next to him, Karen was fighting hard to keep down her hopeful smile, lips straining from the effort. I must ask you though, he added, tone turned darker. Why do you want to leave for village? Naruto reached over and squeezed her hand for comfort. Karen squeezed back, thankful. They treat me like crap in Kusa, she said. I don't have any family left, and I don't want to be used for the rest of my life. Used how? Hiruzen asked. Instead of responding, Karen just twisted her lips into a grimace and looked down at her feet again. Naruto felt her hand grip tighter to his, tendons straining under her skin. Naruto started, trying to think of a good way to explain her situation without bringing up bad memories. Ultimately, he couldn't, and ended up settling for, complicated. Lord Third frowned, but seemed to understand the severity of her situation. I understand, he said at last. I will send a message to Kusa after the exam tomorrow. A deep sigh of relief escaped Karen, and for a second Naruto was afraid she might faint and he'd have to catch her. She didn't, thank God, but she did look faint. It is also helpful that you have family here, Hiruzen added, gesturing to Naruto. That would make the process much smoother. Ya mean it, old man? Naruto cried. She can stay. Yes, he nodded. She can stay. Yes. Naruto cried, jumping up in victory. This is great. He continued. You stay at my place and we can eat ramen for dinner like a real family, and you can have my bed and I can sleep on the couch, like a sleepover. Or like siblings. It's gonna be great, you know. The Hokage just smiled as he watched his surrogate grandson gush about his new family. He'd gone so long without anyone, he deserved this. Karen did the same, soft smile lighting up her face as Naruto rambled on about the things they could do now that they were family. She'd only just met him, but she knew she wanted to stay with him. His chakra was so nice and warm, and they were family. Family. She knew then and there that she was glad to have taken the Chunin exams. She'd found her family. Chapter 28. Naruto woke up early the next morning to a bare apartment. After having Karen over last night, it felt silent and empty, all the cheer and exuberance gone. Once they finished up with their visit to the Hokage, he'd taken her back here and they'd spent the rest of the day talking. Once it got late enough, they ended up making some simple stir-fry before she said she had to go back to her hotel room. He was sad to see her go, but she assured him it was the last time she'd ever be staying with that team. So are you taking the exam tomorrow? He asked as he'd walked her down the road. No, she said, shaking her head in determination. I won't let myself be used by them ever again. Then, they can fail for all I care. Naruto remembered being surprised by her fierce words before remembering how ferocious 17-year-old Karen had been. Then he'd smiled. Well, good night Naruto, she said, offering him a shy smile. She turned to walk into her hotel, but at the last second turned around and flung her arms around him in a big hug. Naruto, too shocked to respond, just stumbled back in surprise. Thank you, Karen whispered into his ear, tears slipping down her cheeks onto his shoulder. Thank you for finding me. Silently, dumbly, he'd slid his arms up around to encircle her as well. Then they had just stood there in the empty street, holding each other. Eventually she'd had to go inside, but it was clear she didn't want to go. Naruto had just smiled and told her to find him after the second exam. That was, if he made it out of the second exam. He didn't say the last part, but he was thinking it. Now it was morning though, and he had a lot of preparation to do. Outside the sun had barely brushed over the horizon, sky still a dull dusty gray above him. On the floor around him were piles of shuriken, kunai, traps, explosion seals, ninja wire, and various other things he would need for the fight later that day. He'd even bought some storage seals from Tenten's parents' shop and was stuffing them full of supplies. He knew Sakura was bringing her big medikit, as agreed upon earlier, and that Sasuke would be bringing his own arsenal as well. It was Naruto's job to pack all the tools for the traps, as well as food since they didn't know how long they would be in the forest for. Ration bars should suffice. Once he'd finished packing, he made his way out of his apartment and into the streets of Konoha. It was still early, so there was little to no one on the streets. The people that were there though shot him nasty looks, oftentimes accompanied with sneers. He tried his best to ignore it but, well, it didn't matter. He was still the hero of Konoha, even if they didn't know it. Training Ground 44 was still fairly empty by the time he made it there. They'd been told to meet there at 8 a.m. by Anko. It was almost 7 now. Naruto, over here, someone called out. Looking over towards the perimeter fence, Naruto saw Sakura waving him over, standing next to a bored-looking Sasuke. She was decked out in her full medic attire, medpack resting just over her waist on her back and hair tees ready for if she needed put it up. Sasuke on the other hand was dressed the same except for a new chikudo strapped to his waist. He had mentioned a few days ago that if they were going to face off against Orochimaru that they'd need to pull all the stops, hence the sword. Morning, he breathed, jogging over. You got all the stuff? Sasuke asked in lieu of a greeting. Yeah, he nodded. You. The Uchiha nodded as well. Great, Sakura said. You both know the plan. The two boys nodded again. Subdue, but don't kill, Naruto listed off. Goal is to detain and bring him in. Then plant the scroll on him with the details for the Oto invasion. Right. Yeah, Sasuke said. And I got the scroll all ready to go. He pulled out an unassuming scroll he'd written up last night and held it up for the rest of the team to see. Using his Sharingan he had copied Orochimaru's handwriting from when he'd trained under him and used that to write said scroll. It detailed the invasion plan as well as the alliance with Suna. If they did this right, it would be enough evidence to help stop the whole thing altogether. The Konoha Crush, as it had come to be known later, wasn't an event they wished to repeat. It had cost them all many lives, including Lord Third's. Okay, great, Sakura said, pleased by their work. And remember, he thinks we're genin. He won't come at us at full strength. Not at first. We need to take advantage of that. She put hard emphasis on the last sentence, green eyes piercing into theirs to make sure they understood. Both Naruto and Sasuke gave serious nods, understanding the weight of the situation. Alright, Sakura sighed. And just remember to stick to the plan. We have to do this right, or else we're screwed. You can say that again, Naruto mumbled. Sakura could only grimace in response. The team slipped into silence after that, unable to think about anything else because of their nerves. What they were about to try was the equivalent of an A-rank mission. Possibly S-rank. They'd done those before, of course, or what worked as an equivalence of one, but this one was different. This one was personal. Sometime later, one of the genin teams started to make a ruckus, drawing the attention of all the other teams. That bitch. A boy cried, frustration clear in his voice. First she fucks off after the test yesterday, now she doesn't show up. Naruto leaning forward where he was sitting to peer around Sasuke so as to get a better view of the shouting boy. It was the Kusa genin from yesterday. The one on Karen's team. If she doesn't get here in 10 minutes, I'm gonna kill her. Aren't those Karen's teammates? Sakura whispered. Naruto nodded, continuing to watch them freak out. They can't go on without a third team member, she noted. Did Karen say she wasn't coming? Yeah, he affirmed. She said she wouldn't be used by them ever again. Sakura frowned, clearly not understanding what she'd meant by that. Well, she said, as long as she's okay, I guess that's all that matters. Naruto smiled to himself. I get the feeling we're gonna be seeing her around here a lot more, you know. Sakura could only look at him in confusion while Sasuke was burying his face in his knees. Sometime later, there was a commotion up at the front near the gate, and someone shouted out over the crowd. Welcome to the stage for the second test, Training Ground 44, a voice called out. All three members of Team 7 looked up to see Anko Mitarashi standing in front of the assembled genin. Also known as, the Forest of Death. The other teams around them all shivered uncomfortably while Team 7 just looked on in ambivalence. You'll soon find out why it's called the Forest of Death, she finished. Sasuke just barely suppressed the urge to roll his eyes, while Sakura bit her cheek to keep from laughing. It was such a pathetic scare tactic she was surprised all the other genin were falling for it. Sure, it was a dangerous forest, but if you were worthy of being a shinobi it was fine. And besides, they survived 5 days in it as actual genin before. It would be such a breeze this time. Now, before we start the second test, she continued, reaching into her jacket. There's something I have to pass out. She whipped out a large stack of papers. You must sign these agreement forms. The surrounding genin began mumbling in confusion. Anko went on to explain, cheerful smile already plastered on her face. There will be deaths in this one, she explained. And if I don't have you sign these, it'll be my responsibility. Then she had the audacity to blush, as if it were something hilarious to her. Now the assembled genin were really freaking out. Naruto could see one team visibly sweating, while Sasuke spotted one that was sharing nervous glancing with their teammates. Anko went on to explain the test before handing out the liability forms. She explained how each team needed a heaven and earth scroll before they could reach the tower in the center, and to not open their scrolls before they do so, or they would face terrible consequences. Like getting knocked out, is that horrible? Naruto thought with a roll of his eyes, remembering what said consequences were. He'd been knocked out plenty of times. It wasn't anything special. Once she'd finished her spiel, Team 7 went and exchanged their liability forms for an earth scroll and went and took their places at one of the gates. Karen's old team was turned away before they could even turn in their forms. They needed 3 after all, and they were only 2. Naruto watched with sick satisfaction as the 2 screaming boys were thrown out. So long, assholes, he thought, wicked grin his by his jacket collar. Eventually they made their way to their gate and waited for the test to begin. Once the gate opened, their plan was a go. For such a place of its moniker, the Forest of Death was oddly quiet. The trees above them were still, no wind moving through them to rustle the leaves or branches. The animal life around them was also silent, with barely a rustle to go off of to show that they still existed. It was as if the forest could sense something evil lurking among its undergrowth, sickening and twisted. Orochimaru, can you sense him yet? Sasuke asked, looking up from one of the traps he was rigging. So far they had rigged about a square mile in total, but still had a bit to go. Naruto, who was standing further away tending to his own trap, just shook his head. No clones have popped yet, he told the Uchiha. So he's not in the 2-mile perimeter. He'd set up a dozen or so clones interspersed around their team in a 2-mile perimeter with the instructions to pop upon spotting the snake Sannin. The memories would rush back to Naruto, who would alert the team, giving them an approximate timetable for when the Sannin would arrive. But so far though, nothing. Are you sure they haven't just missed him? Sasuke shot back. I think it'd be a little hard to miss that much killing intent, he deadpanned, giving the Uchiha the most unimpressed look. Says the guy who couldn't even sense that aim genin, he replied dryly, referencing the aim shinobi that had managed to sneak up on them earlier. He'd gotten a solid hit in on Naruto before the blonde had turned right back around and creamed him. It was thoroughly embarrassing for the savior of Konoha, but he didn't let his teammates see how much it bothered him. Sasuke, however, didn't seem to have been fooled. Both of you, stop it. Sakura called out from a branch above them. She was glaring down at them with jaded eyes, fists curled tightly around a length of ninja wire. You're bickering like genin. We are genin, Naruto pointed out morosely. Don't lump me in with you, Sasuke moaned. But it's true, Pop. Naruto froze. It was his clone. Memories rushed into Naruto's head. Akusa genin running through the woods, malice leaking off them like the scent of decay. 2 miles out to the northeast, moving fast. Both Sakura and Sasuke noticed their teammate's sudden change in posture as he straightened up suddenly, eyes staring into the distance. Naruto? Sakura asked, jumping down to his branch. Is it? He's here, he breathed. Orochimaru's here. Their mission had officially begun. Chapter 29. The forest was still. Too still. The sound of forest animals scurrying around the underbrush was suspiciously absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Up in the trees, Naruto was sitting with his back to a tree meditating, jacket wrapped around his waist. They were planning on using his chains for this, and he didn't feel like buying a new jacket again. Meanwhile, Sakura was squatting on the same branch just a few meters away, nervously tugging at her gloves. Her green eyes were scouring the forest around them, looking for any sign of movement. She hated being caught unawares, and as such was on high alert. Next to her, Sasuke was standing at attention, fingers drumming against the handle of his new sword. Everyone was anxious. And rightly so. Anything? Sasuke asked, eyes still scanning the woods. Naruto, who was tapping into Kurama's chakra as much as he could sense the malicious intent rushing towards them a few hundred yards to their 5 o'clock. 2 minutes, he reported. Sasuke nodded and pulled his sword out. Sakura followed suit, straightening up from her crouch and looking around. They waited for a minute. And another. Until, now, Naruto hissed. All three exerted chakra to their feet as a giant wall of wind slammed into them. Dirt and twigs flew into their vision, threatening to blind them as their hair and clothing whipped about. The bark beneath Naruto's feet threatened to break off, but he grabbed a kunai and plunged it into the branch, holding into that for stability. As suddenly as the wind had started, it stopped. Naruto dropped to his knees. That was close, he huffed, yanking his kunai out. Yeah, Sakura breathed, wiping the grime off herself. Before anyone else got a chance to say anything, an achingly familiar voice chuckled. It echoed in the air around them, making it impossible to locate. Cuckoo. Laughter. The 3 members of Team 7 spun around so they were all back to back, weapons drawn and ready to use. Sasuke's eyes spun into their Sharingan while Naruto and Sakura dropped into readying stances. It seems my prey is stronger than I anticipated, the voice gushed, bloodlust dripping of every word. This will make for a more interesting fight than I imagined. Show yourself, you coward, Naruto shouted, playing the part of a clueless genin. More chuckled followed his declaration. A powerful wave of killing intent swept through the forest. Naruto didn't have to fake the sweat that started to bead on his brow. His limbs were shaking only slightly as the pressure increased. He hadn't experienced killing intent that intense in years, but he was desensitized enough to it that it didn't restrict his movements. Not that Orochimaru could know that. Next to him, Sakura and Sasuke were putting up the same farce, Sasuke with wide eyes and trembling arms, Sakura clenching her kunai like a lifeline. Good, it looked convincing. My, the voice echoed again. 3 little flies caught in my trap. What to do? Shooting them both a glance, Sasuke motioned with his chin behind them, where they'd laid all the traps. The other two gave minute nods, showing they understood. Should I decapitate them? Orochimaru went on, voice coming closer and closer. Paralyze them. So many options. Run. Sasuke shouted. Immediately the 3 were off, racing into the forest. Orochimaru shot after them, jumping out of the trees above them. Somewhere else, Naruto's clones started collecting nature chakra, ready to use at a moment's notice. 3 and 9. Sakura cried, dropping below them. Sasuke reached into his bag and threw a kunai to their right, Naruto following suit to the left. They hit their targets, stabbing into exploding seals on the trunks of some trees, causing a huge smoke bomb to go off. Behind them they heard an amused chuckle. Parlor tricks. How pathetic. But when the smoke cleared, Orochimaru found himself alone. Where could they be? He purred, tongue flicking across his lips. His stolen face scrunched up in thought, eyes flicking back and forth through the canopy for any sign of them. Then he smiled and turned pointedly towards a shrub that seemed to stand out from the rest. Found you. Wasn't hiding. Orochimaru turned around to look at whoever spoke behind him only to find a foot in his face. He blocked it with his arm and quickly jumped away, landing further down the branch. Sasuke straightened up from his failed attack, drawing his Chikudo threateningly. Adorable, Orochimaru purred. A stick. Sasuke's eyes flashed dangerously, red spinning into Mangekyo black. He pushed lightning chakra into the blade, making it crackled with blue light. If Orochimaru got touched by that, he'd be paralyzed. Is it adorable now? He asked with a smirk. The Sanin's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Behind the two, Sakura and Naruto were hiding in some foliage, watching the proceedings below, waiting for their cue. Naruto was sitting perfectly still, gathering as much nature chakra as he could to go into sage mode, while Sakura focused intently on Sasuke. She was watching for the signal that would alert her to go down and join Sasuke in the brawl. Her fists tightened by her side as she watched the two trade blows below, metal hitting metal as Sasuke fought the snake summoner, sword against kunai. Any moment, she hissed, eyes narrowing. There. Sakura saw the flash of lightning that left Sasuke's other hand and shot forward off the branch, hands already flying through seals. Earth style, rock fist. She shouted, slamming her fist into Orochimaru's side. The rock-covered limb crashed into the man's ribs, sickening cracks following. Sasuke's sword rushed in after, sliding between the trapezius muscle and the clavicle. Only for the man to dissolve into mud. Fuck, Sakura hissed, spinning around. Where'd he go? Watch your back. Sasuke shouted instead, throwing her to the side. Sakura skid along the branch, looking up to see Sasuke deflect a snake summons, cleaving its head right off. Show yourself, you dick, he growled. That's not very polite, their adversary's voice sounded from above them. Sakura had only a moment's notice to jump out of the way before the ground that had been below her was impaled by a large snake. The creator hissed in anger, turning its beady yellow eyes to look at her. Looking up, she saw it was actually Orochimaru's arm that he'd only transformed, and grimaced when he pulled it back into his sleeve. Disgusting. Where'd the third go, I wonder, the man mused. Away from you, Sakura bluffed. We're not letting you get our scroll. The comment just made Orochimaru smirk in amusement, seeming to find the idea of them assuming he was after their Earth Scroll hilarious. Even if it was just a farce. Sakura, Sasuke hissed under his breath. Nice liar formation. Sakura nodded swiftly before jumping off out of sight, leaving Sasuke alone with the Sannin. He stepped back into a defensive stance, bringing his sword up to eye level. He knew Orochimaru was after his eyes, aiming to give him the curse mark. That wasn't going to happen this time around if he could help it. Orochimaru smirked before jumping down from the branch, eyes wide with bloodlust. Sasuke jumped out of the way, sword flashing as he parried an attack. Good, he had his attention. Now it was up to Sakura. After trading blows for a good minute, Sakura jumped out of the shadows and hit Orochimaru hard with a punch to the back, sending him flying forward into Sasuke's own attack. A growl of frustration escaped the Sannin as he just barely averted it, substituting himself for a log at the last second. But the two pressed on, relentless. This should be enough time for Naruto. Naruto now, Sakura cried, sweeping her legs under Orochimaru's. From above, an orange and yellow blur shot out of the foliage, ears yellow with orange around the lids. Naruto had entered sage mode. Take this, ya dick. He cried, swiping a fist down. Orochimaru easily dodged only to go careening backward anyway. Ha, nature chakra, bitch. Naruto cried as the Sannin went crashing into a tree. Just like when he'd fought pain, Naruto had pushed some of the chakra out and had managed to hit the Sannin hard in the face despite not actually making contact. Even from where he stood, Naruto could see the bruise already starting to form on the man's cheek. That's some jutsu you have there, the Sannin drawled, wiping some blood from the corner of his mouth. I wonder, he continued. However did a genin like you learn it? Wouldn't you like to know? Naruto shot back, fists balled up at his sides. The grin Orochimaru's mouth stretched into was anything but comforting. Oh, I think I would. Then he vanished in a shunshin. Naruto, to your right. Sakura shouted. Without thinking, Naruto ducked and rolled towards the branch below him, just missing the kunai that would have clipped his ear off. Orochimaru growled in frustration before shooting off after him, feet slamming against the bark as he raced down the tree. His hands were already flashing through another set of seals when Sakura intervened. Not on my watch, she cried, launching herself towards him. Sailing forwards, she wound back her fist, and augmenting her chakra just right, sent it careening into the unsuspecting Sannin. He only had a moment's notice when he looked up before she slammed into him. Boom! Bark exploded everywhere. Spears of wood shot out in all directions, slicing through the air with deadly force. Behind him, Naruto watched as the tree he'd just been on exploded into shards of wood as a crater 10 meters long destroyed the center. Cracks shot up and down the trunk, splintering the wood apart until it just collapsed from the stress. In the epicenter, he spotted a roughed-up Orochimaru shooting away from the destruction, face already starting to peel off. Good, he thought bitterly. They were already making progress. One good punch isn't enough to take me down, Orochimaru sneered, shooting past them into the forest. We have to stop him. Sasuke cried, jumping after him. Naruto followed suit, leaping from one branch to another. In his hands, rigged kunai flashing before he threw them towards his target. They shot into the branches just in front of the man before going off in a violent explosion. The Sannin was forced to find a different route. Naruto, stop him. It was Sasuke who'd yelled. Without wasting any time, Naruto landed on a branch and focused. Suddenly, chains were shooting from his chest, speeding towards the snake Sannin with deadly accuracy. What? They heard the man gasp. In a second he was tangled in the Kekkei Genkai, links wrapped tightly around him. He dropped towards the ground, feet no longer carrying him forward. Summoning jutsu. They heard, and instantly the forest was filled with thick smoke. Naruto felt something in the cloud yank at his chains, and it is all he could do to stop himself from being thrown off the branch. He pulled the chains back in, some links coming back cracked or broken. What had Orochimaru summoned that was strong enough to break chakra chains? Shit, Sasuke muttered next to him. The smoke cleared, revealing a towering silhouette inside it. It reached high up into the canopy, head crushing the top few branches. Beneath it, trees crashed to the ground, foliage breaking apart and flattening under its girth. Only the tailed beasts could match that size, and that destructive power. It's Manda, Sasuke answered. I thought you said you killed this guy before, Naruto panted, hiding behind a tree. Once Orochimaru had summoned Manda, they had pulled all the stops, which had resulted in a chaotic, draining battle. The forest was littered with burn marks and destroyed foliage. Naruto had used his chains 6 times now, which was his limit in a battle, and Orochimaru didn't seem one bit closer to being stopped. Naruto's eyes were vivid yellow with orange around them, signaling he was in sage mode. Across from him was Sasuke, doing the same. Except the Uchiha had his Mangekyo activated. Blood was streaked down the side of his face from when he'd overused his Kekkei Genkai, signaling he was reaching his limit. He hadn't pulled out Susanoo, but it was perhaps only a matter of time before he did. Even so, it was the last of last resorts. He didn't want to go blind, after all. It was bad enough he'd had to use the Mangekyo at all. Yeah, when he was already dying. Sasuke shot back, ducking under another blast of fire. Well, we gotta take him down somehow, Naruto exclaimed. Got any ideas for that? The glare Sasuke shot him was enough to shut him up. Dumbass, we're already at full power. You think of something. Another explosion went off behind them. Alright, Naruto cried, duking around the tree to see if Sakura had survived that one. He sighed in relief when he saw she was the source. She had been going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru for the past few minutes, and even though she was amazing, she still had her limits. They had to figure out something fast. Alright, I think I got it, he finally said. I'll try to use Kurama's cloak with a Rasengan. That should take him down. It didn't even take me down when we fought last time, Sasuke pointed out sharply, referring to their battle at the Valley of the End. How's it supposed to work against him? Just go with me on this, okay? He screamed back. Fine. Thank you, Naruto sighed internally. Then, hey, Kurama, wanna have some fun? Do you even have to ask? The Biju purred back. As soon as he'd finished, corrosive red chakra started to bubble up from under Naruto's skin, boiling like lava. His whisker marks thickened and his ears grew red, pupils turning into black slits. His fingernails lengthened into claws and he could feel sharp canines drop into his mouth. The fox's energy flowed through him like a coursing river, pounding at the edges, demanding to be unleashed. He had to be careful though, one false step and he'd fall in too deep. Alright, he smirked, turning to Sasuke with a feral grin. Let's do this. The Uchiha grinned back before jumping up into the trees. Naruto followed with an excited grin. Above them, Sakura jumped out of the way of a powerful blast of wind chakra, only barely escaping the cone of destruction. She had already used a fair amount of her chakra, and was carefully rationing out what was left, which meant she couldn't afford to waste any on fancy jutsu. A small part of her cursed her younger body for not having better reserves. I must admit I'm impressed, Orochimaru said as he ducked under one of her kicks. Not even a full-fledged Chunin can stand up to me. I'm better than just a Chunin, Sakura thought furiously, dodging a fire jutsu. She went to get in another punch, but was knocked off by a low kick that swept her legs from under her. He hit the branch hard with her stomach, hands scraping against the bark as she tried to catch herself. But, Orochimaru sighed. You're still no Chunin. Sakura looked up and glared at him, spitting blood out of her mouth from where she'd bit her tongue. The Sannin scoffed. Pathetic. Hey asshole. Someone screamed. In the blink of an eye, an orange blur slammed into Orochimaru, throwing him off the branch and away from her. Sakura squealed and crawled over to the edge of the branch, looking down to see where her teammate had landed. A few yards below her, she spotted a fully cloaked Naruto squatting near the snake Sannin, orange chakra bubbling around him protectively. Keep your hands off her, ya bastard! Naruto cried, jumping forward to swipe at the man. Orochimaru reflexively blocked it, only to get burned by the corrosive chakra. He was thrown back again by a fist made of Kurama's chakra shooting out at him, sending him tumbling off the tree. He landed on a trunk below, feet sticking to the side. His clothes were burned where he'd been punched, and a long gash ran down his arm from where he'd tried to block Naruto's attack, blood seeping into the clothing. And he looked genuinely breathless. They were winning. Ah, so you're the Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails, he purred, scooting himself up into a sideways standing position, eyes fixing the boy with a hungry gaze. Naruto felt Kurama's tail lash angrily behind him. Interesting. He didn't want to know what Orochimaru was thinking just then, only knowing that he didn't want to be one of his damn experiments. Forming a hand sign, he summoned a shadow clone and held out his hand. The shadow clone set to work. Now there's a jutsu I haven't seen in quite some time, Orochimaru mused, watching the proceedings in front of him. Blue chakra starting swirling faster and faster in Naruto's palm, glowing bright through the red chakra cloak. I wonder, wherever did you pick it up? Wouldn't you like to know? Naruto growled, dispelling his clone. As soon as he did, he shot off the branch, Kyuubi chakra speeding him up and shooting him towards his target. He held up his hand, ready to slam it into the Sannin. Rasen, five-pronged seal. A hand slammed into Naruto's stomach. And it burned. Ack. Fire raced across his abdomen, burning into his gut. Suddenly, all of Kurama's chakra was sucked out of him, cloak fading away until nothing was left. Orochimaru followed up the action with a swift, forceful kick to the chest, sending him flying backwards into a tree. He held out his hand behind him to break his fall. But crack! He screamed in agony. Sliding down the tree, he hit the ground, hard. The breath was immediately knocked out of him, making him choke on air. His arm was on fire, pulsing so bad he was sure it had its own heartbeat. Without his coat on, he could see from where his face was smushed against the grass the angle his arm was at. It wasn't good. Naruto. Suddenly, Sakura was crouched in front of him, rolling him onto his side. Ah, he hissed, arm flaring with pain. Sakura frowned, looked down. Then, shit, she hissed, catching sight of the bent elbow. Let me see it. No, we gotta get back up there, Naruto protested, already trying to push himself up off the ground. Without speaking, Sakura just shoved him back down, already inspecting the arm. Her hands glowed green for a few seconds, hovering over the injury as a frown of concentration slid over her face. After a moment, she dropped her hands. It's a stage 2 supracondylar fracture, she reported. A what now? He asked. She rolled her eyes in exasperation. You broke your elbow. He dropped his head to ground, frustrated. Well, worse things have happened. He was about to say as much when he tried to move it and a lance of pain shot up his arm, making him bite down on his cheek to keep from screaming. But then again, you can't move your arm, Sakura told him. And I'd heal it, but she was cut off by an explosion a few hundred meters away. That. Naruto grimaced, scooting up into a sitting position. But I'm right-handed, he protested. I gotta do something, you know. Not with a broken arm, you're not. She was cut off by another explosion right above them, this one raining bark and fire down on them. Sakura cut off to cover them both, arms wrapped protectively around hers and Naruto's heads. Once the debris had passed, she pulled away. Arg, Sasuke needs help, she growled, looking up to see the Uchiha going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru. She turned back to Naruto, green eyes hard as ice. Stay here, she hissed. And don't move your arm. She gave him one last glare as a warning before jumping up to go help their teammate. Like hell, he thought, scrambling back onto his feet. His arm was throbbing with pain. Even worse when he moved it, and on top of Sakura practically yelling at him to keep it still, it really limited him on options. He couldn't form hand seals without both hands, having no yet mastered one-handed hand signs. And to make matters worse, he was right-handed, which meant all his weapons training had been with his right. Arg, why hadn't he listened more when Kakashi-sensei made them practice ambidextrously? I'm the goddamn savior of Konoha, he ground out through his teeth, grabbing his jacket from around his waist to create a makeshift sling. If I can't find a way, I'll never live it down. Once his arm was stable, he grabbed a kunai from his pouch and jumped up onto the tree, racing upwards. Above him, Sakura and Sasuke were duking it out with Orochimaru in an intense taijutsu showdown. Sakura was evading nearly all the attacks thrown at her, occasionally landing one of her own on the man when there was an opening. Sasuke was holding his own with his Chikudo, deflecting blows left and right. Dragon Flame Caterwall. The Uchiha cried. Large dragon-shaped fireballs followed the exclamation, diving towards Orochimaru. The blistering jutsu scorched the treetops, almost sending Naruto tumbling back to the ground from the intensity of it. Ah, so the Uchiha has some tricks up his sleeve, does he? Orochimaru chuckled, jumping up out of the way. Sasuke snarled, jumping after him, Sakura hot on his heels. Naruto stopped on a branch below, panting. How was he already out of breath? It's because of the seal, you moron, Kurama's voice suddenly shouted. Seal? He asked aloud, eyes following the battle above. Yes, brat, the fox growled back. That stupid snake put an odd-numbered seal on top of my even-numbered seal. It destabilized your chakra network and cut me off from you. He sounded pissed off. Then, it's honestly a miracle you're not unconscious. So what am I supposed to do? He shouted back, hand gripping his kunai even harder in frustration. How am I supposed to know? I'm not a stupid shinobi. Yeah, but you're part of me. If anyone from the outside had looked upon the scene, they might have been put off by a 12-year-old seemingly getting angry and yelling at nobody. As it was, there was no one paying attention to him. Luckily. Look, Kurama finally said. I can't give you any more of my chakra because of this damn seal, and because of the imbalance sage mode is out of the question. But you're still a stubborn Uzumaki. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Before Naruto could argue further, he felt the fox retract from his mind, leaving him effectively alone. PSH, thanks, he muttered bitterly. But he was still left with one problem. How the fuck was he supposed to take this bastard down? Sakura, he called up, landing on a branch next to her. She ducked under a volley of kunai before spinning to face him. Her hair was disheveled and her clothes were ripped, but other than that she looked alright. Naruto, I told you to stay down. She cried. Your fault for thinking I would, he pointed out. Then, listen, we need a distraction, he told her. We can't disable him head on. What do you suggest? She asked, panting. Look, just distract him and tell Sasuke to follow my lead, he said. Alright. Sakura scowled and pursed her lips, but didn't retort. Fine, she finally said. Just don't take too long. Naruto smirked. I won't. Making the hand sign for the shadow clone jutsu was rather hard with only one usable hand, but he managed to do it anyway with only some contorting involved. He was standing on a branch high above the fight taking place below. Sakura was going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru, dodging his massive jutsu and snake combo attack. She was amazing. But it wasn't enough. Hey, asshole, he shouted down, interrupting them. Breaking off from his fight with Sakura, Orochimaru looked up to see the Uzumaki and his clone standing next to each other, hands held out towards each other for some reason. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, he exclaimed. And I'm not going to lose to scum like you. Below him, the snake Sannin scoffed. You can barely stand up to me, he sidled. What more can you do? Naruto's smirk widened devilishly. This, he grinned. He held up his hand just as his clone popped, and held in it was a swirling vortex of concentrated chakra. The Rasengan. Sakura, now, he shouted, jumping forward off the branch. Immediately Sakura slammed her hand into the ground, activating the seals she had placed beforehand. Ropes shot up from the branch, wrapping around the Sannin with impossible speed, trapping him in place. Take this ya damn snake bastard. he cried, speeding towards the man, face illuminated by his jutsu. He wound back his arm, Rasengan whirring violently, then Sasuke's Chidori went straight through Orochimaru's shoulder. And Naruto's Rasengan into his other. Blood splattered across Naruto's face, splashing into his eyes and mouth. In front of him Orochimaru was being skewered from behind and pinned from the front. In his shoulder, Sasuke's hand still crackled with lightning, making the flesh around the wound smoke and char. Naruto had planned it to be like this. Hoping the Uchiha would catch on to his plan, he had figured the best way to debilitate Orochimaru would be to get him from the back while he was focused on his front. Luckily, Sasuke had picked up on it and had snuck in from behind. In front of Naruto, blood dropped slowly down the Sanin's chest, splashing onto the branch below. And then he laughed. Kukuku cough cuckoo. How amusing, he laughed wetly, eyes fixed on Naruto's. An uneasy feeling settled over the Jinchuriki. 3 genin managed to beat me, he huffed. Isn't that a surprise? Naruto. Sasuke shouted from behind the man. Naruto didn't even have the time to process the cry before Orochimaru started to slide off his pupil's hand and further into Naruto's. Startled, the Rasengan fizzled out, leaving Naruto with a bare palm now pressed against a bloodied shoulder. Unless, the snake went on, tongue flashing across his lips. You're not normal genin. He leaned forward more, mouth opening to show sharp teeth and, Naruto watch out. Sakura suddenly cried. He didn't even get a chance to move before someone barreled into him, throwing him off the branch and into the trees below. The two hit another branch hard, wind knocked out of both of their lungs. Oof, he cried. What was that? The clang of steel above him answered his question before he even finished it. There was a sword clenched in Orochimaru's jaw, one that hadn't been there before. One that could only have come from his mouth, which had been facing Naruto. Sakura had saved him from being stabbed. Thanks, he coughed. Don't mention it, she wheezed back. I think, she continued, eyes flicking to his seriously. It's time, Naruto gaped. Seriously, if we keep going like this he could very well beat us, she reasoned. It's either now or never. We can still wear him down, he argued. I'm not done yet, and neither is that bastard. He gestured sharply with his chin towards the man in question, who was fighting Sasuke in a battle of Kenjutsu. Your arm is shot, he sealed off Kurama, and I'm not gonna let Sasuke use his Manjuko anymore. We need help. Naruto's face twisted into a scowl. He didn't want to agree with her, but she was right. He'd used his chains 6 times already, and they were no match for Orochimaru. As much as he was loath to admit it. Alright, fine, he spat out, looking away. Let's do it. Sakura smiled. Good. Orochimaru stood on the tree branch looking over the forest. The Uchiha he'd just been fighting had scampered off somewhere, withdrawing from the fight without a word. It was like he'd been signaled away, but genin didn't know signals yet. Not unless Konoha decided to step up their teaching, which he highly doubted. His shoulders ached something fierce as he shifted around to get a better look. How foolish he had been. He had been preparing himself for the Jinchuriki's attack, building up chakra to soften the blow. He hadn't even heard the other coming from behind him. These 3 weren't average genin, he could say that much. Not with the Jinchuriki using Sage Mode, or the Uchiha using Mangekyo. Even the girl surprised him, strength reminding him painfully of Tsunade. What was with these kids? Where'd the little kiddies go? He purred, looking around. There were no genin as far as he could see, either having fled or hidden themselves extremely well. Instead of getting an answer though, Sakura stepped out in front of him. You want the scroll? She panted, demeaned hard as stone. Orochimaru locked eyes with her, his own narrowing. Here, she finished. Digging into her pouch, she held up the earth scroll. Her limbs shook as she did so, legs quivering from the strain of holding her up. She was panting from exhaustion, looking to all the world ready to drop. Tisk, you think I'm still after that silly thing? He mocked. A chuckle escaped him at the thought. What I'm after is far more precious than that. He would have thought the vague, harrowing answer would have frightened her. But instead of getting the response he was expecting, the young girl just smirked. I know, she said. Then, twisting on her feet, she flung the scroll through the air into the forest. It fluttered open, paper trailing after it like a ribbon until poof. Orochimaru only stared. What? Out of the scroll popped a proctor, not so gracefully falling towards the ground after being summoned in midair. It was Katetsu, the gate guard. He landed nimbly on a branch below him, looking around in confusion before looking up. His eyes landed on the very battered Sakura, who was no longer putting on a show of fatigue. Sakura, noticing that he saw her, immediately ran down the tree. He's not a genin, she shouted in a shrill voice, gesturing wildly to the Sannin. Kotetsu finally turned around, and spotting their attacker, froze. His eyes went wide and his face pale. Clearly he recognized their adversary. Good. Please, we need help. Sakura finished, landing beside him. Got it, Kotetsu nodded, shaking himself out of his reverie. Get behind me. The genin did as he was told. Naruto hopped down onto the branch from where he'd been hiding, arm still stuck in his makeshift sling. Sasuke followed suit, sword out and ready to use. They weren't taking any chances. In front of them, Orochimaru was watching them with an intrigued eye, arms dangling uselessly at his side, Kusanagi still clutched in his mouth. Alright, the Chunin said. On my signal, run the opposite direction. I'll cover you. Sasuke scoffed. You're only a Chunin, he'll kill you, he argued. Better me than you. The proctor shot back, effectively shutting him up. Now just do as I say. The team of genin scowled, but ultimately nodded. Kotetsu eyed them for a moment before ushering them off, pulling out a scroll of his own and summoning a giant mace. Immediately after he pulled out a paper seal from his weapons pouch and, pushing chakra into it, chucked it into the air. The seal exploded upward and suddenly the forest was illuminated with fireworks. A signal then. Signaling for help won't do you any good, Orochimaru chuckled, watching the Chunin with mild fascination, like how a cat would watch a mouse caught in its paws. You'll be the one who needs help, you snake, Kotetsu shot back before turning around the pushing off the branch, headed after the genin he'd sent off. Orochimaru just smirked before jumping after him. This was getting fun. Below him on the forest floor, the team of 4 was moving quickly through the underbrush, dirt and leaves getting kicked up in their wake. Why are we running? Naruto demanded from in front of the proctor, jumping around a fallen log. We gotta take him down. That man is a Sannin, there's no way I'll let you do that, the Chunin shot back. Not like we have a choice, Sasuke huffed. He's gaining on us. Kotetsu glanced over his shoulder before letting out a loud curse. Indeed he was. Orochimaru couldn't be over 100 yards behind them. How he was gaining with injuries like those he didn't know. Perhaps he didn't want to either. Whatever I do, just stay behind me, he cried anyway. The 3 genin nodded. Skidding to halt in the ground, the Chunin whipped around and, flashing through a few hand signs, shot a large blast of fire shooting out of his hands at the Sannin. Naruto quickly stepped in and helped by pushing some wind chakra into it, turning it into a blistering firestorm. The flames raged forward, rushing through the undergrowth with an unworldly hunger. After a moment, they couldn't even see Orochimaru. It took several moments, but eventually the flames died down, settling into a smoldering crackle. Did that do it? Kotetsu breathed, uncovering his eyes after doing so to hide the light. I think. Sakura stopped dead. Her eyes were fixed on a piece of dirt a few hundred yards away. Slowly, it rose up from the ground, stacking itself into a humanoid figure. The features returned one by one until they were staring straight at Orochimaru himself. Very alive, and very unburnt. His hair unplastered itself from his face and fell over his eyes. The skin across his face was peeling worse than before though, resembling a melted wax figurine. A murderous look bled into his eyes, which were no longer filled with the playful mirth of the hunt from before. That, the Sannin hisses, whipping the rest of his peeling face off, was a mistake. His killing intent spiked, and he rushed forward, ready to kill. Then Naruto screamed. Chapter 30 Silence. The forest was silent, the same way it would be after an explosion, or in this case, a fight. 5 figures could be seen on the forest floor, all bloodied or beaten. Blood dripped onto the ground in an unsteady rhythm, staining the grass it landed on. Naruto, Sakura breathed, breaking the silence. Her eyes were wide, hands held up in front of her defensively. But there was nothing to defend against. Not anymore. In front of her, Kotetsu had the same look, eyes wider and sweat beading his face. Naruto was on his knees in front of them all, panting heavily. Sweat dripped down his brow while his arms hung uselessly by his sides, makeshift sling having fallen off at some point. Is everyone okay? He breathed, looking over his shoulder. You, Sakura tried, fumbling with her words for a moment before shouting, you idiot. Naruto only managed a wobbly smile. Chains of golden light jutted out of his chest, ripping his already torn shirt to shreds. They wrapped around the snake Sannin tightly, links pinning his arms to his side and forcing him to stay on the ground. Naruto had jumped in front of the group before Orochimaru could do anything and had unleashed them, straining his already exhausted chakra reserves. And with the seal on his stomach, the strain was even harder. The action alone could have very well killed him. And he'd known that. But he'd done it anyway. You bastard, Orochimaru suddenly hissed from across the small clearing. His chin was propped up on the ground so he could look at them, hair plastered to his face with both sweat and blood, making an even sharper contrast to his pale skin. He looked livid, the bloodlust in his eyes ebbing out into the air around him. Oh, shut up, Naruto shot back weakly. We got you. You're finished. The Sannin only growled in response. I'll finish him up, Sasuke offered, grabbing a roll of ninja wire from his weapons pouch. Before Katetsu could argue, he jumped forward and kicked the Sannin in the head, knocking him out. He then set to work wrapping his exposed hands in the wire. Once he was almost finished, he slipped a scroll onto Orochimaru's pocket, careful to hide the action from Katetsu. It was the scroll Sasuke had forged detailing the sound invasion due to take place during the third exam. Hey, get away from that man! Katetsu shouted, finally coming to his senses and rushing forward. Sasuke just rolled his eyes but stepped away, making a show of raising his hands in surrender. The Chunin immediately set about securing the area, placing chakra suppressant seals on the Sannin before checking everyone over. Are you all alright? He asked, looking up from his work. Across the clearing, Naruto was panting hard. He was hunched over, beads of sweat dotted his face and brow and covered in grime. He really looked like he'd been dragged through hell. Yeah, he said. I'm great. Sakura just glared at him while Sasuke looked entirely unamused. Katetsu himself didn't look the least bit convinced. Backup should be here soon, he said. So you can let go of the chains now. No, Naruto said firmly, shaking his head. He could wake back up. I'm not taking chances. Katetsu grimaced, but said nothing, accepting the response. Instead he set back to work. Given the reprise, Sakura walked over to Naruto and started checking him over, sinking to her knees so she was at his level. She winced at what she saw. I told you to keep still, moron, she breathed, moving to look at his arm. Naruto winced as she held it up, examining it once again. I ain't gonna back down from a fight, he panted. You know that. For a moment, it looked like Sakura was about to argue, but when she looked up and saw the determined expression on his face, the words died on her lips. She let out a defeated sigh instead. I know, was all she managed. Just then, Naruto doubled over with a cry of pain, shuddering. Naruto! Sakura cried, catching him. I'm fine, he ground out, hands curling into tight fists. It's the chains, isn't it? Sasuke noted, watching the golden Kekkei Genkai start to waver in the air. I said I'm fine, the blonde shot back, voice shaking from exertion. You just went up against a Sannin, Katetsu suddenly shouted at them. You shouldn't even be alive. Guess we're just full of surprises, Sasuke muttered back. The comment was met with a doubtful stare, but no verbal response. The group waited in silence after that for backup to arrive. And after 5 minutes, it did. Anbu dropped down from the trees above, landing in a perfect circle around them. Accompanying them was none other than Anko Mitarashi, eyes practically on fire. Naruto, who was just barely holding it together, managed to give them a pathetic wave in greeting. Unsurprisingly, none of the Anbu returned it. Cat, boar, Anko called out. Secure the area. Rabbit, fox, bird, take care of him. She gestured sharply to Orochimaru, eyes full of the arrivals branched off to deal with the still unconscious Sannin, following her orders, while the other two went over to the small team. You can let go of the prisoner now, Uzumaki, the cat Anbu said. Naruto spared him a doubtful glance, but listened anyway. Anbu were trained to handle situations like these. He could put his trust in them. Following his orders, he let go of the chains. Immediately Naruto felt the toll it had taken on his body as they zipped back into him. His breathing was labored and he felt his heart beating erratically in his chest. He sagged towards the ground, falling into Sakura's grip like a sack of flour. You shouldn't have pushed yourself so hard, she scolded quietly as she held him up. He was breathing so hard he could barely respond. Not like I had a choice, he finally managed to breath back, a small smirk on his lips. Above him, he could feel Sakura roll her eyes. Excuse me, someone above them interrupted. Naruto didn't have the energy to look up, only managing to catch a glimpse of their sandals. Are either of you in need of medical attention? Ah, so it was a medical ninja. Yes, Sakura announced, slipping into doctor mode, as Naruto liked to call it. Her demeanor turned hard and serious, all signs of fatigue and weariness vanishing, replaced instead with the cool level facade of a seasoned medic. My teammate is suffering from chakra exhaustion and a stage 2 supracondylar fracture to the right humerus. I suspect bruised ribs as well. It's not that bad, he grumbled from her arms. Ignoring him, Sakura went on. I have a few lacerations and bruising, but nothing severe. And Sasuke has some mild second-degree burns. The medic maid hummed in acknowledgement before shouting orders to some of his comrades. Naruto listened as the ninja rushed about before he felt someone take him out of Sakura's arms and ease him onto a stretcher. I can walk, he grumbled weakly, trying to push himself up. Unfortunately, his one good arm didn't seem to be enough and he fell back down, vision swimming. Above him, Sakura just scowled, eyes glaring daggers at him. Please stay down, Uzumaki, one of the medics said firmly. He only listened because he saw Sakura cracking her knuckles in the background. Take them to the hospital, he heard Anko call out from the side. We'll clean up here. By now, Naruto's vision was started to darken, black creeping up along the edges. His limbs felt heavy as lead, making it near impossible to turn his head to see what was going on. The Hokage will want to speak to them, Bor announced, ignoring Anko's orders. He can wait, Anko shot back threateningly. Hospital first. When they didn't move, she threw a round of Senbon at their feet, shouting, now. The Anbu nodded reluctantly before ushering the medical ninja off. And that was the last thing Naruto saw before his eyes slipped shut, exhaustion finally taking over. Kakashi's day was going rather slowly. Because he didn't have a genin team to teach, he had nothing on the calendar. And wasn't that odd? He had grown so used to managing his little demons that 5 days without them seemed, well, boring. And Kakashi did not do well with boredom. He considered taking Guy up on a challenge, but ultimately decided against it, choosing instead to hang out in the Jonin lounge with all his other sensei comrades. It had been dull, but they made good company. He actually made conversation. So that was new. It was sometime around 1 that he left to find some food, anything but Ikiraku's, but upon returning to the lounge a few hours later, he was met with a scene of chaos. What's going on? Kakashi asked, watching all the other Jonin run around frantically. You haven't heard? One asked, stopping in front of him. He shook his head. Orochimaru appeared in the Forest of Death. No one knows how he got in. Forest of Death. That's where the second exam was taking place. What happened? He asked, stomach already starting to sink in dread. He attacked a genin team, the Jonin told him, face like stone. Kakashi's stomach felt like lead now. His hands started to shake. Not his team. Please, not his team. They were strong, but Orochimaru was a Sannin. Not even Kakashi could stand up to him. He didn't want to know, but he had to. Which team? He demanded. The hospital was bustling with people just like any other day, which wouldn't have annoyed the ex-Anbu had it not been that his team was somewhere in it, possibly dying from their wounds. Kakashi shoved people out of the way as he made his way to the front desk, earning him a few glares and frustrated exclamations. He didn't care though. He had things to do. Sliding to a stop in front of the front desk, he rattled off breathlessly, Naruto Uzumaki, Sakura Haruno, and Sasuke Uchiha. Where are they? Sir, I'm sorry, but they're not allowed any visitors at the moment, the front desk nurse apologized. The statement just made Kakashi angry. I am their Jonin sensei, Kakashi Hatake, which means I have family visiting rights, he spat out. I demand to see them. Let him through, a new voice interrupted. Kakashi looked up to see the cat Anbu standing off to the side, apparently having just arrived. I can watch him. Hesitantly, the nurse nodded before pulling out the sign in form and handing it to him. Not one to waste time, Kakashi just signed a Henehene instead of his name before rushing off towards the Anbu. Thank you, Tenzo, he said, heading off down the hall. Of course, Senpai, his friend said, following after him. What happened? He asked, getting straight to the chase. Nobody's been giving me a solid account. None of the Jonin he's spoken to had offered anything beyond, Orochimaru attacked some genin, and that he'd been apprehended. So it wasn't a surprise that Kakashi was freaking out upon learning that it had been his team that had been attacked. Orochimaru showed up in the Forest of Death during the second exam, Tenzo listed off. He and 2 others had been impersonating a team of Kusa genin, we know so because a group of us found the bodies this morning. Without their faces. A cold shiver of dread ran through Kakashi at the report. Orochimaru could do that. At this point though he really shouldn't be surprised. Then what? He demanded. Tenzo let out a sigh before continuing. We don't know, because the genin haven't said much, he said. But apparently he attacked them and engaged in a battle. What he was after we're still not sure. He hasn't said yet and neither have your students. But eventually, during combat your team managed to signal for help in the form of opening a scroll which summoned a proctor. Whether they knew that would happen or not is still up in the air, but with the help of Katetsu they subdued Orochimaru and brought him in. Kakashi faltered in his steps. They what? Subdue a Sannin? Impossible. Yes, Tenzo responded. There were 2 puncture wounds in Orochimaru's shoulders that restricted his movement along with multiple burn marks and lacerations. He was also chakra deprived, meaning he really put up a fight against them. While Tenzo was speaking, Kakashi's mind was working at 100 miles per hour. My genin, he thought. Did that? What happened to them? He managed to ask. If they were all in the hospital, it was for a reason. And knowing that they had gone up against a Sannin, the Uzumaki was hit with a seal that shut off his access to the Kyuubi. It unbalanced his chakra system immensely, Tenzo reported. They discovered it during surgery. We're still trying to find someone who can undo it. Surgery for what? He wondered nervously. The stone that had formed in his stomach grew heavier. The girl, Sakura, received multiple lacerations and suffered minor chakra exhaustion, his friend continued. The least injured is the Uchiha boy, with only a few cuts and burns. It was all Kakashi could do to keep one foot in front of the other as they walked down the hall. How could this have happened? Are they all right? He finally managed to ask. The Anbu's silence only made his stomach sink lower. The then Anbu stopped in front of a door and reached to open it. I'll let you see for yourself. Chapter 31. Sakura was sitting up in her bed when the door to the hospital room slammed open. Everyone's eyes shot to the doorway to see a breathless-looking Kakashi-sensei standing with the Anbu cat, looking more worried than he'd ever seen him. Her sensei's eye flew across the room frantically before landing on the 3 of them. They were all in beds, covered in bandages and in varying degrees of alertness. In the furthest one from the door, Naruto was out cold, right arm wrapped tightly in cast and chest bound from the few fractured ribs he'd collected. Next to that was Sakura, and closest to the door was Sasuke. Around the walls 2 Anbu stood at attention, watching over them while a medic worked on Sasuke, having already treated the other 2. Upon seeing his team safe and alive, Kakashi-sensei's shoulders sagged in relief, and all the tension draining away from his expression. You 3, he sighed, stepping into the room, are going to be the death of me. Behind him, Cat followed and closed the door behind him, taking up his place as guard along the wall. Instead of speaking right away, Kakashi-sensei's eye moved between his 3 students, inspecting their injuries. His gaze landed on Naruto's cast for a long moment, grimace forming under his mask. Sakura didn't miss how he winced slightly either. Appearing to shake himself off, he moved on to the other 2. He noted how Sasuke was covered in various band-aids from all the cuts and burns he'd gotten while Sakura's hands were wrapped in tight bandages, blood just barely seeping through. They looked like they'd completed an A-rank mission, which they might as well have. Glancing around the room, he looked at all the Anbu carefully, as if judging their character. Sakura, Sasuke, he started, not looking at them. Have you spoken to anyone about what's happened? Cat answered for them. Not yet, Hitaki. Kakashi-sensei looked ready to roll his eye at the formal use of his name. Then, shooting his 2 conscious students a firm look while addressing the Anbu, said, everyone out. For a second, none of them moved. Then, we're under orders not to leave them, Bor said from by the window, sounding oddly unsure of himself. Sakura watched as Kakashi-sensei's eye narrowed dangerously, staring the Anbu down threateningly. I said, he reiterated sharply. Leave. I wish to speak to my students alone. Still no one moved, although there was some uncomfortable shifting around the room. Finally, seeming to have had enough, Kakashi-sensei snapped, now. Immediately, all the Anbu shunshined out, leaving just a rush of wind behind. Only Cat remained by the door, looking indecisive about leaving. Sakura blinked, surprised. She knew Kakashi-sensei had been Anbu, but he wasn't anymore, so didn't they technically outrank him? Which left her wondering why they followed his orders. You too, Tenzo, Kakashi added in a softer tone, not looking back at Cat. If he hadn't been wearing the mask, Sakura was sure she would have seen the man roll his eyes. Stop calling me Tenzo, senpai, the Anbu just muttered back, moving out of the room. Then stop calling me senpai, Kakashi-sensei shot back half-heartedly. It sounded like a practiced script the way they said it, making Sakura wonder, just who was Cat. Well, Tenzo, apparently, she thought to herself. But who the hell is that? Alright, Kakashi-sensei said, closing the door behind the Anbu. We're alone now. You can relax. How he knew that having the Anbu around was making them tense baffled Sakura. But she didn't question it. Cat told me none of you would talk, he started, eyeing the 2 of them. I thought I trained you better. You did, Sakura said. It's just, we haven't thought up a good story yet. Naruto was supposed to help downplay it, it wasn't supposed to end this badly. We're still processing it, Sasuke jumped in. The grateful look she shot lasted not even a second, but she was sure he saw it. That man was terrifying, he lied. It's hard to just think about. Their sensei seemed to accept the answer though, nodding sympathetically. Understandable, he hummed. I won't make you give your reports today. Sakura's shoulders sagged a barely hidden relief. At least they now had more time to think up a plausible story. But, their sensei added. You will have to eventually. He's an S-class rogue ninja, what he was even doing here is a mystery that we need to solve as soon as possible. Sakura blinked in surprise. Have they not found the scroll? She thought, remembering the falsified scroll detailing the Suna-Oto alliance. Or maybe they have and he just hasn't seen it yet. Yes, that made more sense. Alright sensei, the two genin nodded. Kakashi sensei seemed to be pleased by their answer, closing his eye in what looked like relief. A long moment of silence stretched between the three of them, wherein Kakashi sensei just stood there, observing them. His lone gray eyes swept over to Naruto again, this time locking on instead of glancing over him. Slowly, Sakura watched as their sensei made their way across the room to stand over his conscious student, guilt etched onto his face. He looked like how he had when he'd brought Naruto back after his and Sasuke's fight when the Uchiha had deserted. Broken. Grieving. It was a painful sight to see on someone you looked up to. What happened? He finally asked. I still trained on Naruto. His voice almost sounded hoarse. Whether he was talking about the battle in general or about Naruto she couldn't tell. She decided to answer both. We fought really hard, she offered. But I guess he figured Naruto, she trailed off. He was in his way, Sasuke finished somberly. In his way of doing what? Her sensei asked, barely suppressing his wince. Sakura quickly shared a glance with Sasuke, as if to ask him if it was really a good idea to tell their sensei. Sasuke just gave her a small nod in reply. My eyes, he said coolly. He wanted the Sharingan. The sickened look that flashed across Kakashi sensei's face reverberated deep in Sakura's bones. She knew that feeling, had lived with it for 3 years before she heard the snake Sannin had died. Absolute and utter disgust. The Sharingan, he echoed. Sasuke nodded. What for? Honestly, Sakura didn't know. She always figured he'd wanted it to be stronger. To be the perfect shinobi. Or maybe there wasn't a good reason and it was just the desire of a power-hungry madman. No idea, the Uchiha answered. And that was that. The disgusted look in their sensei's eyes slowly turned somber as his gaze landed back on their third teammate. And Naruto, he finally rasped out. He protected us, she offered. He used this, orange chakra, she continued, trying to sound ignorant. But then Orochimaru did something that shut it off, so he used his chains. Then, in afterthought, added, even though he'd already used them 6 times. They all knew the implication of that. The chains took up 1/8 of his total chakra stores each time he used them. They weren't like his shadow clones which just divided themselves equally. Meaning Naruto very well could have died of chakra exhaustion today. The thought was terrifying. Kakashi sensei's head dropped towards his chest, eyes squeezed shut. Sakura could recognize his easy breathing as a grounding tool, taking note of his clenched hands at his side. It was all the signs of an impending panic attack. I'm glad you're all alive, he breathed, voice just barely staying level. I don't know what would have happened if, he didn't need to finish the thought. Then, straightening up suddenly, he said, I'll be back soon, and swept out the door. Sakura and Sasuke could only stare at the door as it was closed behind him. Rocks. Dust. The smell of blood. It was all swimming in Kakashi's mind as he stumbled through the hospital corridor. Leaning against the wall, he could feel the onset of a panic attack, something he hadn't had since his days in Anbu. Sakura's words had shaken memories loose that he'd tried not to touch for a long time. Obito. Damn Minato's son. Why did he have to be so much like his idiot teammate? Self-sacrificial bastard. Logical, he knew Naruto was fine and alive in the hospital room, but all his mind could see was Obito pinned under a boulder. A boulder that had been meant for him. Naruto could have died. Minato's son, his legacy could have died. And Kakashi couldn't have done a thing about it. And to learn he'd used Takubi's chakra to stay alive, Kakashi wasn't sure if he was grateful or terrified. Letting out a shaky breath, Kakashi loosened his fists, forcing himself to relax. He was a Jonin, an ex-Anbu commander. He had to be in control. He had to calm down. Somewhere preferably with lots of distractions. Those usually helped him get his mind off whatever is troubling him if his books couldn't. Making up his mind, he stuffed his hands into his pockets and headed forward. Lobby it was then. It had been almost 2 hours before Kakashi started to feel normal again. Stupid PTSD. He was reading his book in the lobby partially because he loved fucking with people, partially because why not when a shrill voice distracted him. Please, I just want to know where he is, the voice pleaded from the lobby. Kakashi looked up curiously to see a young girl with bright red hair looking up at the nurse manning the check-in station with wide red eyes, practically in tears. I'm sorry, but that's confidential. Only family members and Anbu are allowed there, the nurse apologized. So she was hoping to visit one of his students. Probably a Sasuke fangirl. But I am family. The girl cried. I'm his cousin. Cousin. That piqued Kakashi's interest. Pushing off the wall, Kakashi walked up to the arguing duo, not paying attention to their conversation anymore. Bright red hair, not an Uchiha, talking about a boy, Kakashi knew exactly who this girl was. Excuse me, he interrupted, stepping into the conversation. But I couldn't help but overhear you were here to visit your cousin. The girl looked up, startled. Kakashi noticed the tear tracks that ran down her face, some old, some fresh. She was wearing a Kusa headband, indicating she was here for the Chunin exams. She looked like a mess. Uzumaki, I presume. Slowly, the girl nodded, looking rather timid while doing so. Naruto, she started uncertainty. I heard he was in here and I wanted to see him. But no one's letting me through. She looked down at her feet, distraught. I just want to see if he's okay. Kakashi hummed thoughtfully in response. She didn't seem like a threat, or a spy. And she looked genuinely shaken up. Besides, if it had been a farce, Kakashi would know. I'll take her back, he told the nurse suddenly. Below him, the girl perked up in startlement. Are you sure, Hitaki? The nurse questioned, glancing nervously towards the girl's headband, obviously concerned about a foreign ninja becoming involved with their Jinchuriki. Kakashi just crinkled his eye up into a smile in response. Don't worry about it, he said lightly. I'll keep an eye on her. The nurse looked doubtful, but ultimately couldn't oppose him. He was a Jonin after all. Just sign here, the nurse murmured, pushing the sign-in sheet towards her. Kakashi watched her as she scratched the name, Karen Uzumaki, onto the paper. So her name was Karen, huh? Follow me, he said lazily, walking away from the nurse's station. He heard a scrambling of feet behind him before he felt her presence at his side, nervous and small. He pushed through the double doors into the hallway and listened as she followed along. The two walked in silence for a few moments before he spoke up. So, Karen, he started, making her look up. How did you meet Naruto? He jumped in my face and said we were family, she said in a small voice. Then he took me out to ramen and told the Hokage he wanted me to live with him. Kakashi sighed. Sounds like Naruto. When did this happen? He asked. Surely he would have heard about it if it had happened before the exams started. Naruto could never shut up about whatever he was excited about. And he was sure he'd have been very excited about finding family. Before the first exam, he answered. I don't know how he knew. Maybe he could feel my chakra too and figured it out. 2. So you're a censor? He asked lightly, already knowing the answer. Minato was a censor, but he was pretty sure the young blonde didn't have such an affinity. It was only one more question atop the ever-growing pile his genin were throwing at him. Yeah, Karen answered. And his chakra feels really nice, she admitted. It's really warm and bubbly. Not like my team's. Theirs is coarse and dry. Kakashi hummed. And powerful chakra sensor then. They took a turn down another corridor, approaching the closed-off wing the Anbu were watching. So, what happened to him? She finally asked, referring to Naruto. No point in sugarcoating it, Kakashi thought morosely. He was attacked, he supplied succinctly. By a very powerful rogue ninja. How? Karen gasped, whipping her head around. We don't know, he admitted grudgingly. During the second exam his team was ambushed by the Sannin Orochimaru, forcing them to fight for their lives. He broke an arm and suffered chakra exhaustion from overusing his Kekkei Genkai. Among other things, he added mentally, remembering the seal placed over the cubies. He's still recovering. Kekkei Genkai, she whispered, partially amazed and partially confused. Kakashi just nodded in response. It's a rare Uzumaki trait, he said. Who knows, maybe you have it, he mused offhandedly. But it's very chakra intensive. He isn't supposed to use it more than 8 times a day. 4 or 5 in a fight. How many times did he use it? Karen asked. Kakashi sighed heavily. 7. The two shinobi entered the closed-off ward under the Anbu's watchful eyes before arriving at Team 7's shared room. Easing the door open, Kakashi let Karen slip in first. Hesitantly, she stepped into the room, eyes drifting around before settling on Naruto, who still appeared asleep. Sasuke immediately sat up at attention at the sight of the redhead, but calmed down once he saw rush over to Naruto's side. I found her in the lobby, Kakashi offered lamely as Karen started looking her cousin over. Figured she wasn't a threat. I wouldn't be so sure about that, Sasuke muttered quietly. Only Sakura heard him, and she shot him a withering glare in response. You're Naruto's cousin, right? Sakura asked, turning to Karen. The girl in question nodded, not looking up from Naruto. He'll be all right, won't he? She asked nervously. Sakura let out a small chuckle in response. It takes more than a broken arm and some chakra exhaustion to take him down, she said warmly. He heals fast anyway. But still, he could have died. She pointedly refused to acknowledge the memory of squeezing his heart just to keep him alive. She didn't need to think of that right now. Or ever. Honestly, I'm surprised Kakashi-sensei hasn't exploded yet, Sasuke commented from the side. From Naruto being such a dumbass. Oh, believe me, Kakashi spoke up. Once he wakes up, he'll be in for an earful. Sakura smiled cheekily from her bed, glancing over at her blonde teammate. Getting chewed out by Kakashi-sensei was never a fun thing. She didn't envy him. After that, the group lapsed into silence. Karen sat by her cousin's side, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Occasionally she would rub absently at her arms, frown decorating her face. Sakura knew she was thinking about all the bite mark scars, having seen a few of them herself. Was she thinking about letting Naruto bite her? From the pained expression on the Uzumaki's face, Sakura assumes that she was. Eventually, the redhead looked up from her worrying and at the rest of the team. So would it be alright if I maybe stayed with you guys, for a little bit? Like in the hospital? Sakura asked. Karen shrugged, embarrassed blush turning Dr. Face red. I was thinking just like, in general, she trailed off, eyes dropping down to the floor. Sakura saw the moment for what it was. She remembered the Kusa genin she'd been with throwing a fit before the exam, pissed at their teammate for not showing up. She understood if Karen wanted to be as far away from them as she could. Yeah, I think that'd be fine. The small smile Karen offered was enough to let Sakura know just how grateful she was. Eventually the three kids slipped into casual conversation, attempting to make jokes and bitch about teammates. It was awkward, but they were making it work. At some point Kakashi was called out by an Anbu to come look at some evidence they'd found. Something about a scroll. He left Karen with the other two, trusting them not to let her get into any sort of trouble. He wasn't worried though, she seemed stable enough. He spared them all one last glance before closing the door behind him. They were all smiling. All roughed up of course, and one still sleeping, but smiling and talking. In that moment he realized just how proud of his team he was. He really did love them. Chapter 32. It was well into the night by the time Kakashi ended up leaving the hospital. The streets were practically deserted, only the occasional pedestrian meandering between buildings, most likely drunk. The village was otherwise peaceful, going about its night as if nothing had even happened. Even though so many things had. Inside, Kakashi was tearing himself up over his current predicament. On one hand, he didn't want to leave his students and the Uzumaki girl alone, knowing just how vulnerable they were. But on the other, he knew that if they had to call him in, it was serious. But then again, he thought. An S-rank rogue ninja broke into the village and attacked a team of genin. It was an all-hands-on-deck situation, regardless of rank or skill. He knew the T&I department would have their hands full right now, as well as the Black Ops. Really, everyone Tokuho and above would be scurrying around like crazy. Maybe Hiruzen had just let him have more downtime because it had been his students that had been in the line of fire. Or maybe not. You could never quite tell with the third. Eventually he made his way up into the Hokage's office, pushing the doors open silently. He was met with a room full of Jonin and Anbu. At the moment he entered it looked like Shikaku Nara and the Hokage were discussing something. It stopped when he entered. Ah, Kakashi, there you are, Genma greeted off to the side, staple Sanbon hanging out of his mouth. Ma, why am I here? Kakashi asked, getting straight to the point. Genma frowned in response. Kakashi didn't mean to be rude, but he had been dragged away from his injured students. So sue him if he was a bit short with others. It was the Hokage who answered. We found a piece of evidence on Orochimaru that we wanted you to analyze, Hiruzen reported. It's a scroll detailing Orochimaru's plans. Our T&I department has already looked it over and copied all of the data and are looking into it, but we were hoping you with your Sharingan might be able to find anything we haven't. It's doubtful there is anything, but we can't leave anything to doubt. Not with Orochimaru. Kakashi nodded in understanding. He wouldn't put it past Orochimaru to do something sneaky like that. And since he was the only able-bodied shinobi with a Sharingan in the village, the task automatically fell to him. Understood, Lord Hokage, he nodded. I want you to report back to me on your findings, if any, as soon as possible, Hiruzen continued. And as Shikaku and I were just discussing, we also will require a report from your genin. Kakashi's fingers curled into a tight ball of their own accord. Couldn't the man give his students a break? Understood, he said instead, voice strained. Good, Hiruzen hummed. Shikaku, the scroll. The Jonin commander nodded and pulled out an unassuming scroll from a pocket, handing it over to Kakashi. The contents of the scroll are being investigated as we speak to check the validity of them, he said. All we need from you is to check for hidden info. Kakashi nodded, staring at the scroll in his hand. Take as long as you need. Understood, Kakashi nodded. And with that, he was dismissed. So, Orochimaru wanted to attack Konoha. And he wanted to use Oto and Suna to do it. Well, that was something. And to use Suna's Jinchuriki to do it, what a mess. Sighing heavily, he ran a tired hand down his face, eyes looking off into his empty apartment. Kakashi had spent the last hour going over the scroll, dissecting it for every bit of info he could. So far, he hadn't found anything with his Sharingan. Realistically, he should have turned in his findings, or lack thereof, hours ago. But something about the scroll was bugging him. Something about it just didn't sit right, and for the life of him he couldn't figure out what. Sighing in frustration, he set the scroll down and focused back on his now cold cup of tea. He couldn't remember how long ago he'd made it, probably hours by now. The only thing that would make it redeemable would be heaping spoonfuls of sugar. A shiver ran down Kakashi's spine at the thought. Ew. Sighing, the Jonin leaned back on his couch, head bumping into the wall behind him. Sunlight was just starting to peek in through his window, lighting up his room with a golden glow. It was the middle of the night when he'd last looked up, or sometime in there. Absently, he realized he hadn't visited his students at all since being called in, and wondered if Naruto was awake yet. If he was, then he felt guilt for not stopping by. It wasn't that he had to be at their side 24/7, but he hated seeing his students in that state, and perhaps seeing the blonde idiot's stupid grin would remind him they were, in fact, okay. But they weren't. They were almost killed by Orochimaru, a Sannin, and had somehow survived. Somehow, his genin had gone up against an S-class ninja and had only come out with chakra exhaustion and a broken arm. And also a cousin, but that wasn't related to the fact. Sighing again, Kakashi dropped his head back forward towards the scroll in his hand, eye flicking over it for what felt like the 1000th time. And for all he knew, it could have been. This was useless. He was getting nowhere. On a hunch, he packed up the scroll in his weapons pouch and got dressed before hopping out of his window. The morning was still cool despite it being July, clear sky promising hot temperatures later. Ignoring that, Kakashi leapt across the rooftops, headed towards the archival building. He needed to check something out. The archival building was rather empty when he arrived. The halls were barren of any shinobi coming or going, offering him a straight shot towards the records department. When he arrived, he was met with the sight of a lowly paper ninja bent over his desk, seemingly focused on his work. Kakashi slapped a hand down on the desk to make his presence known. I need to see all the mission reports submitted by Orochimaru before his desertion, he said briskly, not giving the desk clerk a chance to breathe. I'm afraid I can't just let you see, the man started. Kakashi raised a hand and cut him off. I don't need to see the classified ones. Just a few. He was getting impatient. The desk clerk gave him an odd look, but ultimately nodded. He was led back into a large warehouse-esque room filled with filing was where all the reports and documents regarding shinobi were stored, ranging from academy student grades to A-rank mission reports. The S-rank mission reports and S-class documents were kept in another building though. Things like Tenzo's info and anything regarding Naruto's parents. It was all tucked away elsewhere where no one would accidentally go poking their noses in it. Kakashi may have broken into it once or twice, but no one needed to know that. Here we are, the Chunin grumbled, stopping in front of one of the cabinets. All of Orochimaru's reports, he said, then added, the non-redacted ones, anyway. Kakashi hummed in acknowledgement before setting to work, pulling open one of the cabinets and pulling out random reports. Can I ask what you're looking for? The paper ninja asked. Kakashi paused in his motions. No, he said. And that was that. With a grumbled sigh, the Chunin turned away and told him he could have all the time he needed. Not that Kakashi needed permission. He waited until the shinobi was out sight before setting to work. After accumulating what felt like enough papers, Kakashi settled down and began to read them. He wasn't looking at the content per se, but at the handwriting. His hunch was far-fetched, but plausible. For some reason he had a feeling the scroll that had been found on Orochimaru was a forged one. He couldn't put his finger on why he felt that, but it was a strong enough itch that he couldn't ignore it. And after being a shinobi for 21 years, he had learned to trust his gut instinct, even if it didn't make sense. Sitting down against the filing cabinets, Kakashi settled in for a long research session. He had a feeling this wouldn't be easy to prove. And he was rarely proven wrong. It must have been nearing the afternoon when Kakashi finally looked up from the papers. He had gone through every single report the Sannin had written that wasn't classified, and had compared it to the scroll. So far, nothing seemed out of place. And it was pissing him off. What is it? The Jonin agonized. He had been so scrutinizing. Analyzing every kanji, every hiragana. He was tempted to start ripping out his hair, it was annoying him so bad. He felt like the answer was right in front of his face, so obvious he shouldn't even have to think. And yet, any luck, senpai? A familiar voice spoke up behind him. Kakashi turned around from his seat on the floor and found himself looking up at his old subordinate, Tenzo. Same old, he sighed wearily, turning back to the scroll and papers in his hands. He hadn't even heard the Anbu enter, he had been so focused. How do you know I was here? He asked. Overheard some paper ninja whining about, a rude old man. Figured it had to be you. A sharp laugh escaped Kakashi. Old, huh, he sighed. Well, he supposed silver hair and deep-set eyes would do that. Just what exactly are you looking for, senpai? Tenzo finally asked, crouching down next to him. Kakashi just sighed again. I'm not sure, he admitted, staring at the papers in front of him. But for some reason I think the scroll they found on Orochimaru was a forgery. A pause. I just can't explain why. Tenzo's eyebrows shot up, eyes going wide. A forgery? He asked, taken aback. But who would have known all that? And better yet, why would they have put so much sensitive info on one document? The implication was clear. Orochimaru wasn't stupid. He wouldn't go around carrying detailed plans of a mission for anyone to read, and he wouldn't have any of his underlings doing the same. The man was as meticulous as he was insane. He didn't make such foolish mistakes. So to think that someone that knew the plans well enough had done so on purpose baffled them. I don't know, Kakashi ground out. And that's what's frustrating me. Tenzo's frown deepened, and he looked down at the papers. So you're looking for proof of a forgery? He clarified. The Jonin next to him just hummed in confirmation. Have you compared handwriting? He asked. Yes, Kakashi hummed. It matches. Prose. Yes. Style. Also yes. The Anbu sighed, deflating. I don't really know what else there is then, Kakashi hummed, letting his eyes slip close as he leaned back against the wall. He'd hoped for a moment that fresh eyes would have been of some help, yet that had proven to be a false hope. Maybe you're thinking too hard about it, senpai, Tenzo finally offered. Maybe it's not. Underneath, he teased. The smile was evident in his voice. Don't use my own words against me, Kakashi shot back half-heartedly, no real heat behind them. Tenzo just smiled softly, finding the whole thing amusing. Perhaps it's nothing, he offered with a shrug. Maybe your age is just finally getting to you. Instead of laughing, Kakashi just turned his lone eye to Tenzo and gave him the most deadpan stare he could muster. Tenzo at least has the decency to look embarrassed. What are you really here for, Tenzo? Kakashi suddenly asked, demeanor hardening. Tenzo, noticing the shift, dropped his guilty face, expression mirroring the ex-Anbu's. Anbu was able to verify the information detailed in that scroll, he said, expression stony. Suna and Oto really are planning an attack on Konoha. Kakashi let out a weary sigh, letting his head fall back against the filing cabinet he was leaning against. He was doing that a lot lately now that he thought about it, and the Kazekage's children. Still taking the exam, the Mokuden user reported. We will apprehend them for questioning after the second test is over, as well as all other Suna and Oto genin. Kakashi hummed, nodding. It sounded fair. And my students? He asked. Still under watch at the hospital. They have yet to give their reports though. The Haruno girl claims she doesn't want to until Uzumaki is awake. So he's still out, huh? Kakashi thought to himself. At least they were still okay. He hadn't seen them since last night, but this was a shinobi village. Life moved quickly and things could change in an instant. Thank you, Tenzo, the Jonin nodded. The Anbu nodded before standing back up, clearly intent on getting back to his duties. Anytime, senpai. He was gone in a shunshin before Kakashi could even respond. Stop calling me senpai, he muttered anyway. He received only the cool draft of the filing room as his response. Sighing to himself, Kakashi turned back to the scroll, this time not focusing too hard on it, letting his eye skim over the text instead. A few minutes later, he realized what was wrong with it, and cursed himself for not catching it sooner. The kanji for leaf. It was wrong. It wasn't anything major, but on closer inspection, he noticed how the brush strokes in the scroll differed from the ones in all of Orochimaru's reports. It was obvious that there was an attempt to replicate the original, but perhaps the person copying it had no reference for how the Sannin wrote, leaf. And it showed, because Kakashi recognized that kanji. He'd seen this iteration enough to know exactly whose handwriting it was. What with how many mission reports he'd had to look over the past few months. Something inside Kakashi's chest clenched at the realization, turning his stomach to ice. He should have seen it sooner. The handwriting was Sasuke's. Chapter 33. Why would Sasuke? Why would he? Why? The thoughts were flying through Kakashi's head faster than he could keep up with them, leaving him sitting on the hard floor of the filing room clutching the scroll, eyes staring blankly ahead. His student had successfully forged a scroll in the handwriting of someone he hadn't met. He had filled it with accurate data regarding an impending invasion. He had presumably planted said scroll on Orochimaru after a confrontation with him, meaning he knew he would have a confrontation with him. And that he would win. Kakashi felt something in his throat catch. How? How did Sasuke know Orochimaru? How did he know about the invasion? How did he know he would meet him in the exam? How did he know about any of this? Better yet, did Naruto and Sakura know about this? Was Sasuke acting alone or with others? Was his student a spy? No, if so, why would he plant so much data on a criminal? Could he be in contact with a double agent working for Orochimaru? If so, it would make sense if he left their data out. But he was a genin with no reason to converse with someone like that, so that wouldn't make sense. He needed answers, he realized. And he knew exactly where to get them. The prison was oddly quiet considering how many people occupied it, Kakashi thought to himself as he made his way through the stony corridors. Guards were stationed every 10 yards, rigid as lamp poles. They looked either afraid, or on edge. Or both. And Kakashi honestly couldn't blame them, considering who they were guarding. He himself could barely face the man, let alone try to guard him. It was understandable they'd be nervous. Hataki, someone said from further up ahead. Glancing up, he was met with the familiar brown eyes of Yugao, his former underling. I'm here to see the prisoner, he said, foregoing formalities. Behind her mask, Yugao seemed taken aback, but didn't question him. With a quick hand signal, the Anbu guarding the alcove of the cell moved away, allowing him passage. Actually, I'll need some privacy, Kakashi amended. Yugao shot him a concerned, quizzical look in response. Senpai, she started to argue, but he stopped her with a wave of his hand. I won't be long. I only have to ask a few things. Things you can't ask in front of the Black Ops. The Anbu wearing a deer mask argued. Kakashi thought. He must be new. I don't recognize him. An S-rank rogue ninja managed to break into a hidden village and infiltrate the Chunin exams and nearly kill my students. So sorry if I'm a little suspicious of people right now, Kakashi spat dryly, not the least bit sincere. The Anbu looked ashamed for a moment before backing down. Alright, Yugao piped up. But you get 5 minutes. No more. Kakashi nodded. Understood. Yugao gave him a long look before motioning to her subordinated to leave. She waited until they were out of sight before turning back to him. I hope you know what you're doing, she whispered. Something in Kakashi's chest tightened uncomfortably. He came down here for answers. But something told him he wouldn't like what he was about to find. He didn't say any of this aloud though, instead only replying with, so do I. Before he'd approached the alcove of the cell holding the Sannin, Kakashi had paused to push his headband up his forehead to reveal his Sharingan. He had a feeling he was going to need it soon. Kakashi, the Sannin greeted with a sickening smile as the Jonin stepped into the light. What a pleasant surprise. Kakashi only narrowed his eye in response, killing intent leaking out of him. The Sannin sensed it and frowned, playful attitude evaporating in an instant. Not in the mood for games, I see, he grumbled. Sasuke Uchiha, Kakashi bit out instead, getting straight to the point. What is he to you? The Sannin's frown deepened. His amber eyes narrowed, practically glowing with malice in the dark cell. A replacement, was all he said. The answer sent shivers down Kakashi's spine, but he refused to let it show. He wanted the Sharingan he remembered Sasuke saying. Is this what he'd meant by that? Strengthening his resolve, he curled his fists and set his shoulders, not letting himself be deterred by the man and his twisted desires. Have you ever spoken with him before? In disguise or otherwise? He asked. Only his brother, the man admitted nonchalantly. Not a very good conversationalist. Kakashi almost scoffed at that. Almost. And this? He held up the scroll. Orochimaru looked at it, no hint of recognition flashing in his eyes. Is this a test? He asked dryly, glaring back at the Jonin. Answer the question, was all Kakashi said. Sighing, Orochimaru rolled his eyes but replied. It's a scroll, he stated. I have eyes, Hitaki. The humor wasn't appreciated. It was confiscated off you when you were brought in, Kakashi told him. Did you know it contains every detail of your plan to invade Konoha next month? Including information about your little spy, Yakushi, and those Oto Genin. Orochimaru's eyes widened comically. He straightened up, face paling more than it already was considerably. Holding the scroll up, Kakashi unraveled it, letting the paper go almost until the floor before halting it. In the dim light of the prison, the kanji and hiragana scratched onto it were just barely visible. But it was enough. Orochimaru's eyes narrowed before widening, lips sliding into a thin line. How? He breathed, staring wide-eyed at the characters. The quiver in his shoulders and under his eyes told Kakashi it wasn't a farce. Which only proved to worsen his troubled thoughts. Why would Sasuke Uchiha have access to this information? The Jonin finally growled out, both eyes narrowing in seething anger. Obito's Sharingan was spinning madly in his eye socket, showing just how serious he was. Orochimaru, though, to his credit, seemed genuinely surprised. I've never spoken with Sasuke Uchiha in my life before the other day, he rasped out. I have no idea how he would know any of this. It sounded sincere, and not in the way that a lying ninja would make it sound, but genuinely, truthfully sincere in only a way someone with nothing to lose would sound. Something Kakashi knew very well. Then why would he knew your handwriting and prose to AT? I have no idea, the man bit out, scowl painting his features. He's not my spy if that's what you're thinking. How he got this information is as much a mystery to me as it is to you. As well as how he and his aggravating teammates managed to put me in this cell. He spat the words out like venom, teeth showing in his anger. The fury radiating off him was almost palpable. Kakashi almost had to take a step back just from the force of it. But he didn't. What do you mean? He asked wearily, narrowing his eyes. It was the Anbu who had brought Orochimaru in. Not his students. Orochimaru huffed. It seems someone didn't read the reports, he scoffed, anger receding somewhat. Tisk, I expected better from you, Hitaki. The reports hadn't been written yet, but he didn't tell him that. Taking a deep breath, the Jonin composed himself and tucked the scroll into his weapons pouch. There was nothing more he could learn here. He turned to leave, but was stopped by Orochimaru's voice. How long do you think I was fighting them before they summoned that blasted proctor? He asked. Kakashi's feet halted on the ground. Part of him did want to know, but another dreading the answer. His students were strong, he knew this. But strong enough to keep up with a Sannin before calling for backup. It was unnerving. Orochimaru took his hesitation as a sign to go on. A good half hour at the least, he offered. Maybe more. I wasn't paying attention, I was having too much fun. Fun. Kakashi shivered at the word. I haven't had a challenge so thrilling in a long time, the Sannin went on. It was rather refreshing. Refreshing, Kakashi echoed in disgust, whirling around. They're 12. You could have killed them. You say it like I didn't try, Orochimaru said with a frown. My, you have such little faith in your students. It sounded like an insult, the way he said it. As if he weren't a competent teacher who knew his students. Which was bullshit. Kakashi cared for his students immensely. He made it a point to know them. Just what was this snake bastard getting at? Narrowing his eyes, Kakashi glared at the man. He hadn't given him any answers or explanations on the scroll. He was just a sick, twisted monster with nothing more to offer him. We're done here, he said succinctly, turning around and heading off down the hall. Oh Kakashi, the Sannin called out in a sickeningly sweet voice, stopping him in his tracks again. Don't you want to know how your precious little genin managed to beat me? It's quite an interesting story. Part of Kakashi wanted to know. Desperately wanted to understand how his students could have stood up to such a man. The other, larger part though wanted to get away as fast as possible. He didn't want to be near the man any longer than he had to. He didn't get the option to choose though as Orochimaru continued talking. You don't seem to be in the mood, the Sannin sighed. But, he added, I will say this much. Your students know some very interesting jutsu. Some of which I haven't seen in 13 years. Kakashi's hand twitched. Some of which only one person in the world knows, he continued. What are you talking about? Kakashi finally hissed, shooting a glare over his shoulder. He saw Orochimaru standing at the edge of his cell, practically pressed up the bars, wicked grin plastered on his face. I'll only say this, he hummed, making Kakashi narrow his eye. If Jiraiya didn't teach that Uzumaki brat his father's jutsu, I wonder who did.